Did the author of Luke Acts use Josephus' work to fluff up his account with historical data? That's the question. Since starting MythVision, Derek here, I've always read Acts as a fantastic story, or even an epic of the origins of the early Christian movement. I had no clue that the authors of Luke Acts may have copied his historical data from Josephus, and even made mistakes along the way. I interviewed Dr. Steve Mason, who is an expert on Josephus and has written extensively on Josephus and the New Testament. And he shows really solid evidence that Luke Acts is using Josephus in crafting his story. That interview is years old, and recently I called Dr. Mason to ask him if he would be so kind to write a script showing the evidence that Luke Acts clearly borrowed from Josephus. And from this point onward, this is what he wrote. Buckle up and prepare for the best Luke Acts dependence on Josephus video in the world. Everything I'm about to read from this point onward, in this script for this video, are the words of Dr. Steve Mason. What is a Luke Acts? Is it like an Edison screw or a Higgins boat? Or did you say Luke Acts, the philosopher? This might have been my response to hearing Luke Acts in my late teens. Having grown up in an evangelical family, I knew about the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. They came up often in Sunday school morning services and the evening services that filled our Sundays, also in Bible study and youth group. But Luke was different from Acts. My family were Pentecostals, and the book of Acts had a special place for Pentecostals because it gives examples of speaking in tongues, their distinctive practice, that began during the Jewish festival of Pentecost, 7 weeks after Jesus' crucifixion at Passover, and that is where the Pentecostal name comes from, Acts 2, 10, and 19. So I heard plenty about Acts, but Luke was just one of the 4 Gospels, which we read as one story from different angles. We didn't study each Gospel separately. Anyway, Luke was separated from Acts by John. Even after attending a Bible college, I don't think I heard anyone speak of Luke Acts in that world. Things may have changed since then. Fortunately for me, by blind luck, I then landed as an undergraduate in Canada's McMaster University. McMaster's Religious Studies department didn't offer New Testament as a study area. If you were interested in the origins of Christianity, you studied Judaism and early Christianity. Jewish texts such as the large libraries of Philo, Josephus, Qumran scrolls, and rabbinic literature were not background as they usually are in seminaries. Because of their size, they were the main dish from which Paul's letters and the Gospels were offshoots. McMaster's historically oriented program shaped my outlook. It was a big help as I gradually moved away from my evangelical background. No easy transition. Why am I recalling all this? Because it was at McMaster that I first discovered the 2-volume work, Luke Acts, and a wonderful, completely new discovery, Josephus. As I began to think historically in the McMaster environment, ignoring the later New Testament, the justification for Luke Acts became obvious. They present themselves as 2 volumes of the same work, Acts 1:1, and Luke's prologue, 1:1-4, anticipates both. Once we read them together, we notice the overall structure. For example, after Luke's infancy narrative in chapters 1-2, in the Gospel, Jesus moves steadily toward Jerusalem, the climatic site of his death and resurrection. You can see the sources in Luke. Acts mirrors this. It radiates outwards from the new Christian base in Jerusalem to the ends of the earth and Rome, Acts 1:8. Only then did I begin to see how brilliant it was that the writer we call Luke, he did not leave his name, broke from the pack and devoted separate volumes to Jesus' life and what came later. The other Gospels had to squeeze a lot of later church concerns, anachronistically, into their stories of Jesus' life. Each one must use a single volume to have Jesus himself express the author's views about their own time. For example, Mark 7:19 has Jesus abandon Judean law in language taken from Paul. Look at the sources. Matthew rejects Mark's Jesus, insisting that his very Jewish Messiah insisted on scrupulous adherence to the law. Matthew 5:17-20. He also has Jesus talk about the church as though it already exists. John goes his own way, giving Jesus theological discourses on his heavenly origin and spiritual presence with the community. Several sources from John. Frequently speaking of light, life, and truth, John's Jesus says things like in 6:53-57, apparently with reference to the communion or Eucharist celebration. If you don't eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. The one who munches on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. The one who munches on my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So whoever munches on me will live because of me. It is impossible to mesh these self-focused speeches with the pithy parables and proverbs in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which John does not have. This author has theologized Jesus' teaching for his own time. The author of Luke Acts saw the problem and took a more sensible approach, finding these attempts by others confused. He insisted on keeping everything in its proper order, Luke 1:3-4. The only way to avoid anachronism was to separate Jesus' life in the Gospel of Luke, which occurred wholly within Judean society and following Moses' laws, from the later growth of the church after Jesus' resurrection, which gradually moved away from its Judean base and abandoned Moses' laws in Acts of the Apostles. He refused to squeeze those later developments into Jesus' lifetime. And then, Josephus. What a discovery. 30 volumes by a Judean author who knew what he was talking about. Josephus was a skilled writer, too, though his literary pretensions aimed a few notches higher than Luke Acts. He makes frequent allusions to classical Greek works of history, epic, tragedy, philosophy, and oratory. The author of Luke Acts may have known some of this, but if so, he kept it mostly hidden. His Greek is entirely correct and his style appealing, much more than Mark's, but it is far simpler than that of Josephus. Josephus, born in 37 of the Common Era, was a member of the Jerusalem's elite upper priestly class, with family connections at the highest level. He was such a high flyer in his mid-20s that he was chosen for a diplomatic mission to far-off Rome. Sailing was always hazardous, and his ship sank, forcing him to swim to save himself. But he survived and accomplished his mission, gaining access to Nero's imperial court to free some fellow aristocrats who were detained there. His facility or fluency in Greek, upper-class Rome was bilingual in Latin and Greek, and his diplomatic skills must have been impressive. Josephus returned home to Jerusalem with his liberated colleagues in mid-65 of the Common Era, just as tensions were rising there because of the harsh exactions of Nero's agent, Gessius Florus. When the unrest looked like it would provoke the medicine for which Rome's legions were famous, 66 to 67 of the Common Era, 30-year-old Josephus was sent north to meet the Romans, to try to negotiate a way out. This time, he did not succeed. He was captured by the Roman general Vespasian and spent 2 years in custody. Nero, who had sent Vespasian to Judea, took his own life in mid-67 CE, initiating a fierce competition among his generals to succeed him, and suspending Vespasian's Judean campaign for 2 years. 2 contenders, Galba and Otho, fell in rapid succession before Aulus Vitellius prevailed in April 69 of the Common Era. Neither Vespasian nor his soldiers could tolerate Vitellius as emperor, however, and Vespasian decided to launch a coup. To make a long story short, Vespasian found in Josephus a useful asset. The foreign nobleman Josephus could honestly say that the Judean God and scriptures were behind Rome's power and even Vespasian's rise. Josephus was freed from his chains and accompanied Vespasian's son Titus, who had destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE after a siege, to Rome. That is where he wrote his 30 volumes, 7 on the Judean War in the late 70s CE, 20 volumes reaching back to describe Judean origins, laws, and values in Judean antiquities in 93 CE. A single-volume autobiography around 93 to 95 CE, and a 2-volume essay on Judean antiquity, misleadingly known as Against Appian, in the late 90s of the Common Era. Josephus' support for Roman rule and the Flavian family of Vespasian are not central to any of his works. No, he writes as a proud Judean aristocrat, explaining his people and their ways to Roman audiences. Those were his main concerns, but since he believed that only God could arrange the rise of nations to great power status and their fall, as previously with Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks, he occasionally reflects on the futility of resisting God's will and facing pointless destruction. Josephus did not present Rome's view of things, but Rome's rulers were happy with the Judean priest's account because, at the end of the day, it encouraged cooperation with their rule. To help us think about the connection between Josephus' works and Luke Acts, we should realize that almost immediately after he wrote them, his works became famous in Rome and abroad. He claims that the future Emperor Titus added his signature to his war, finding it the most authoritative account. Josephus was quickly acknowledged as the unmatched expert in Judean history and culture. It seems that the Roman historian Tacitus borrowed from his works just a few years later in writing Book 5 of his histories, given the striking verbal agreement between them. Later in the 2nd century, the Roman grammarian Aelius Herodian cites Josephus for everything related to southern Syria. Christian writers then began to use his works extensively. The early 4th century Eusebius, who was close to the Emperor Constantine when he made the empire Christian, incorporated much of Josephus' work into his own histories, ensuring his fame for all time. Eusebius chose Josephus because he was the most credible historian of his time. He claims that a statue in Rome honored the Judean. So before we consider the shared material in Josephus and Luke Acts, then, we can see that if any ancient author wanted information about Roman Judea, Josephus' War and Antiquities were recognized as the best sources almost immediately after their completion. Preparing to think about Josephus and Luke Acts. As my Greek improved during grad school and I gained a broader perspective on ancient ways of writing, I studied Josephus and Luke Acts ever more thoughtfully. My first proposal for a PhD dissertation was to compare Josephus' portrait of Jerusalem's chief priests and Pharisees with that in Luke Acts. As I began intensive research, however, I found that several books on the Judean leaders in Luke Acts were in preparation. There was no point in competing with them, or with the overwhelming interest in New Testament texts. The best course for me was to focus on Josephus. His 30 volumes, more than Luke Acts, offered a mass of material that had hardly been studied, unlike the Christian texts. In those days, too, scholars were beginning to agree that new research was needed on the Pharisees. Pharisees had been a flashpoint in relations between Jews and Christians ever since ancient times, because they appeared so differently in the canonical text of each tradition. The Gospels mostly treat them harshly as pettifogging legalists who went out every morning looking to catch people in some failure to observe either Moses' laws or their own human, the Gospel writers claim, traditions. Unable to tolerate Jesus, they quickly plot to kill him. Mark 3:6, Matthew 12:14, John 6:18, 7:1, 19:32, 8:37, and on and on. In Jewish rabbinic literature, by contrast, eminent Pharisees espouse deeply humane views. The rabbis, who saw themselves largely as the Pharisees' heirs, show boundless understanding of the command to live by Moses' laws, not to view them as a burden. We see this in the Mishnah, Tractate Sanhedrin, which outlines principles for Jewish courts. It is hard to imagine anyone being convicted of a serious crime in such courts, because they make so many provisions for fairness and redress. Given this disparity in sources cherished by Christians and Jews respectively, which had propelled much Christian antagonism toward Jews through the Second World War, then playing a part in Europe's toleration of atrocities committed against Jews, academic historians in the 1960s through 1980s realized that proper historical work was needed to figure out what the Pharisees were really about and how they attracted such different portraits. For me, this was a perfect opportunity to examine Josephus' portraits of the Pharisees. As a Greek author, Josephus had not been part of mainstream Jewish tradition, which ran from the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, through rabbinic literature. But nor was he a Christian. He was a proud and outspoken Judean. That does not mean that he was neutral or objective, but only that his perspectives needed to be investigated. What I hoped to bring to the table, and this is crucial for the question about Josephus and Luke Acts, was a new approach to Josephus' works. I developed this as I saw how other classical, meaning Herodotus, Thucydides, Tacitus, Livy, and biblical authors were being studied in the 1980s. Rather than treating them as mere repositories of data, as in days of old, scholars were increasingly reading them as intelligent and creative authors who carefully structured their works, imbued them with consistent themes, and carefully chose their vocabulary to make a coherent impression. The study of Josephus was lagging far behind in this way, however. Most scholars who used Josephus were specialists in early Christianity. It was convenient for them to cite his accounts as raw data without regard to context, as background to the New Testament. They could justify this in part because the few earlier specialists in Josephus had assumed that Greek Hellenistic culture had not penetrated Josephus' homeland of Judea. So even those specialists tended to view Josephus as an Aramaic-speaking priest from a backwater of the empire, incapable of writing high-level Greek or offering thoughtful political analysis. Those scholars assumed, therefore, that Josephus must have borrowed all the sophisticated Greek and reflection we find in his works from Roman official accounts of the war for recent stuff, or from nicely written accounts of the older events. Many of them also thought that he used skilled assistants in Rome to turn it all into readable narratives. In short, in the 1980s, Josephus was still mainly valued as a transmitter of information written by others, with little intelligent input of his own. In those days, it was common to read in textbooks that Josephus tells us X, meaning that X probably happened, unless there was reason to doubt Josephus. But Josephus's own thoughtful contribution was assumed to be negligible. It was somehow neutral data, floating in the air and available for use with no real home. Things were gradually changing in the 1970s and 80s. That was largely because a team of German academics had the brilliant idea of creating a concordance to Josephus. This would examine Josephus's distinctive use of Greek. Working through every Greek word in his corpus, they would list all the occurrences, giving a few words of context. The authors also presented a summary at the beginning of each entry, giving the main uses of the word in question, with examples. Eventually published in 4 large format volumes, the concordance was finished in 1983, just as I began my research. It was an unbelievably important resource. Before it appeared, the scholars' views I described above were based on intuition. They thought, okay, this doesn't sound like Josephus. I feel like he must have borrowed it from Nicholas of Damascus, say. The concordance brought an end to all that woo-woo speculation in principle, though many researchers were slow to take advantage of it, preferring their hunches to what could be demonstrated. But the concordance allowed us to quickly check Josephus's typical words and phrases and constructions. Today, digital tools have largely replaced it, though not completely. They make it even easier to find Josephus's distinctive language because all known ancient Greek texts are available at our fingertips. This explains the idea behind my dissertation and later book subtitled A Composition Critical Study. With the help of the new concordance, I would investigate Josephus's descriptions of the Pharisees, not as disembodied data mindlessly copied from a source, but assuming that he was an intelligent author who expected to be understood. What did Josephus mean by portraying the Pharisees as he did? Why did he include Pharisees in his accounts? How did they contribute? What roles did they play? What language did he typically use to describe them? For example, he says in several places that Pharisees were reputed to interpret the laws with precision. Most scholars took this to indicate Josephus's approval, partly because they assumed that he was a Pharisee. That seemed unlikely to me because A, Josephus presents his priestly class as the proper interpreters of the law. B, he often disparages the Pharisees. And C, he elsewhere uses this construction, were reputed to, with precision, when he is about to demolish the reputation in question. We could only see this with the aid of the new concordance, however. It helped greatly in understanding Josephus's works as thoughtful compositions. It enabled me to offer a new picture of Josephus's Pharisees and how they fit in his narratives. One casualty of this approach was the old view that he claimed to be a Pharisee. I argued that the half sentence in his autobiography, commonly read as a claim to Pharisaic identity, has been misinterpreted and actually conveys something else entirely. He says that after investigating the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes as a young man and finding none of them satisfying, he went off to study with a tough teacher named Banis in the desert for 3 years. That is where he found true philosophy. After that period of bliss, however, it was his duty to take up public duties in Jerusalem. So he returned to the city. Taking part in Jerusalem's public life required, however, deference to the Pharisees. He has already explained that the Pharisees' lenient way of interpreting the laws makes them popular with the masses, with the result that even Sadducees, though they hate Pharisees, must follow their legal system when they enter public office, or the masses would not tolerate them. Josephus makes it clear that he was no Pharisee. He viewed the group with some contempt, and he insists on the severity of Moses' laws with the Sadducees. He celebrates the fact that Judean law requires the death penalty for many offenses, when other nations have gone soft. But deference to the Pharisees' legal system was a requirement of public office, which he had to accept as he became active in Jerusalem's political life. I am explaining all this because the question of how we read Josephus as a mine of disembodied portable data, or as a thoughtful narrator, determines how we see the connection between Josephus and Luke Acts. My dissertation research convinced me that every author's writing, including yours and mine, is highly distinctive. Nobody can write neutrally or just facts. As soon as we write sentences and paragraphs, we abandon neutrality. Writers must make constant choices, as I am now. How to structure the whole piece, the tone and register I'm aiming for. What kind of audience do I imagine? How to structure each sentence, short and punchy or allow some dependent clauses, and the words I choose for tone and effect. Should I use only common words or sometimes rare terms for an exotic twist? Do I want to use words that might suggest associations outside this text? The choices never end. This means that every composition unavoidably carries the unique fingerprints of an author. It belongs in that home text and cannot simply be reused for a different composition. That would be like splicing in a section of black and white film from a creative production of the 1940s and splicing it into a color film, even if it was on a related subject from the 1990s. It would stick out like a sore thumb. In the days before AI or even the internet, it was common for professors to have this kind of experience. I would be reading a first-year student's essay, noting a few sentences that included a grammatical error or two. That was fine. Their writing would improve. But then, all of a sudden, came a few sentences in perfect prose of a high level, with more specialized vocabulary, used with precision and sophisticated turns of phrase. Then it was back to the low-level writing. I could be sure and confirm my impression with a bit of checking that the student did not write the high-level bit. It belonged to another, created by a different mind. Beginning students knew they were supposed to consult sources, and when they found expert writing, they wanted to use it to enhance their work. But to be charitable, they hadn't always understood yet the need to separate that from their own work and to credit the other author. An experienced reader could easily spot the borrowed text, however. Visitors to archaeological sites might see a wall made of large stone blocks, but wait, what's going on there? A block near the bottom fits in the space, but it has ornate decoration not found on the other blocks. That decoration is not self-contained, but obviously part of a bigger design. This can only mean that it was not designed for this wall. It has a function here, holding up the rest, but its home was elsewhere. Someone needed a block for the present structure, found it or pried it loose, and reused it without caring to match the original artwork. Many important inscriptions in Israel and Italy have been preserved only because they found such secondary use. Their original contexts are lost to us. We should be grateful. The principle of secondary use is crucial for assessing the Josephus Luke Acts question. So I'm going to emphasize it. Independent creators write to suit their project. If we find bits and pieces of text in a work that bears the hallmark of another home, they must be in secondary use. To be sure, they must have a function in the new place, as a reused block helps to support a new wall. Or the later author would not have borrowed them. But that will not be the same function as they originally had. Only if we can keep this principle firmly in mind is it worth looking again at the Josephus Luke-Acts parallels. Are we ready? Josephus and Luke-Acts. Background. The parallels between Josephus and Luke-Acts are not new discoveries. Thoughtful readers of Josephus and Luke-Acts discussed them since at least the late 19th century. Scholars with historical outlooks have always been struck by the remarkable coincidence that Josephus and Luke-Acts, alone among early Christian texts, would feature the census under Quirinius, the rebellion led by Judas the Galilean, a rebel named Theudas, a group called Sicarii, someone called the Egyptian prophet, and a tetrarch named Lysanias of Abilene. In a multi-volume study of Acts produced a century ago, 1920s, some contributors wondered whether Luke got this material from Josephus, but in those days, there was no way to check. That is because, as I've just explained, Josephus's works themselves were treated as a compilation of diverse material with little design. So when scholars noticed that Luke-Acts used the parallel items in different ways from Josephus, meaning an empire-wide census, dating Theudas before Judas, or making the Egyptian prophet a leader of Sicarii, they figured that Luke could not have taken this from Josephus. If he had, they thought, surely he would have followed Josephus's order. The only alternative seemed to be that Josephus and Luke-Acts used the same sources. That may still be the majority view today, but it's a Hail Mary pass rather than a thought-out hypothesis. What do I mean? First, the assumption that ancient writers would copy their sources without change is easy to disprove. Look no farther than the Synoptic Gospels. According to the main theory, Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, but they freely changed what they borrowed to suit their own stories, both by supplementation and by radically changing the source when it did not suit them. Examples are Matthew's revisions of Mark's episodes that present Jesus' family, meaning Mark 3:19-21, or students in a bad light, Matthew 14:33, 16, 17-19, 20, and Luke's revision of Mark's trial narrative. Readers who know something of ancient rhetorical education will not be surprised. The whole point of that training was to be able to take any material, even from classical sources, Homer, tragedy, great oratory, and rework it for one's own purposes. No one assumed that a writer should respect the original sense and context of borrowed material. Paul certainly does not do so when he quotes from the Bible, for example in Galatians 3:10-14. The second problem is that scholars who ascribed the Josephus Luke-Acts parallels to a common source never explained what that source looked like. This problem was fatal. The common explanation of the material shared by Matthew and Luke, that they do not take from Mark, basically sayings of Jesus, is that it comes from a hypothetical source conveniently called Q. Because this imagined source is so important for their use of the Gospels, scholars work tirelessly to reconstruct it, its themes, possible social context, audiences, themes, and perhaps even stages of development in it. To do this, they study the Matthew-Luke agreements with razor-sharp care to weed out what looks like Matthew's or Luke's language. That allows a complete picture of both the original saying sources, with its own distinctive themes and language, and then its secondary use in both Matthew and Luke for their different purposes. The second most common explanation of synoptic problem dispenses with Q. But that requires the hypothesis that Luke had no qualms about exploding Matthew's neatly configured speeches, such as the Sermon on the Mount, to locate their bits and pieces in different places that suited Luke's very different account. But no one has ever given the first clue about what a hypothetical lost source for Josephus and Luke Acts looked like. They have not tried, because I suspect it is a hopeless task. Anyone who tries will end up with a source that looks pretty much like Josephus. To see why this is so, we are now ready to consider some of the most telling examples. Property registration under Quirinius. To understand the first example concerning the census under Quirinius and the rebellion of Judas, we need some historical background. The year 6 CE was a watershed for Roman Judea. Rome's rule over the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, which they called Syria, had begun 63 BCE with Pompey the Great. The Romans preferred to govern provinces without a big investment of soldiers and resources. Where possible, therefore, they chose a local strongman to manage the new territory as a king. King Herod proved to be so effective, ruling around 40 to 37 BCE, at this, when he died in 4 BCE, Rome decided to keep the party going. Emperor Augustus divided the kingdom into 3 and parceled it out to his 3 surviving sons in their early 20s. 2 of these proved to be winners in Galilee and the north, Antipas and Philip. They ruled even longer than King Herod, well into the 30s of the Common Era. The 3rd son, Archelaus, however, was a dud. He managed to offend everyone under his rule, including both Judean and Samarian leaders, who normally hated each other. They both sent embassies to complain about him to Augustus. He banished Archelaus to the far west of the empire and suspended the system of Herodian kings ruling the Judean heartland from Jerusalem. This was a watershed because Archelaus' incompetence made the Romans nervous about trusting any other local big shots, even another son of Herod, with the rule of southern Syria. I call it southern Syria because that is how the Romans saw it. Pompey had annexed the whole seaboard, or Levant, in 63 BCE, creating a huge province of Syria. This was governed by a senior citizen, often in his 60s, with headquarters at the province's north end in Antioch, now in modern-day Turkey. He was based there because his most important task was to command 4 legions. They were stationed near the Euphrates River because that was the frontier with Rome's toughest enemy, the Parthian Empire based in Iran and Iraq. But this left the southern zone of Syria very far from the capital, about 3 or 4 weeks' march from north to south. The Romans were not worried about Parthian incursions in the south from Lebanon to Gaza because large deserts lay in between. So it was efficient for Rome to let a trusted petty king such as Herod rule the southern part, even as he acted in his own interest, keeping the peace and ensuring the success of crops and trade. Such a minor monarch would be securing Rome's rule without cost to them. It's a win-win. When Archelaus proved useless, however, Augustus decided that it was too much of a gamble to use another local in his role. Instead, he sent a lower-rank Roman official to handle things in the south, whereas the northern governor was an esteemed senator who had held the highest rank of consul in Rome and now served as the emperor's personal representative, or legate. The man sent to the south was from Rome's lower equestrian order, knights. He reported to the legate, who could send him packing to Rome if he screwed up. And he commanded no legions. The army of Herod, which may have had 18,000 soldiers, shrunk under Archelaus and then vanished when he was deposed. Only about 3,000 of his soldiers moved to coastal Caesarea as a police force under the new man there. They were a locally recruited auxiliary army, mostly from Samaria, the centuries-old enemy of Jerusalem. The coastal city of Caesarea, which became the headquarters of the lower-ranked governor, the procurator or prefect, was a Greco-Roman city, which Herod had built in honor of the Emperor Augustus. Its magnificent, man-made harbor quickly made it a major trading port. Although its population included a minority of Judean traders and business people, it was not Judean in atmosphere. It boasted a temple and sacrifices to the emperor and Roman gods, as well as entertainment facilities for games that would have violated Judean customs. So the shift from Jerusalem's being the capital of a Judean king Herod to its being reabsorbed into the province of Syria in 6 CE was a huge deal. But the change had been pushed by Jerusalem's high priest and his priestly class. According to Judean law and tradition, they were supposed to run Jerusalem according to Moses' laws. They had not liked having King Herod or his son Archelaus breathing down their necks. Monarchs demanded absolute obedience and could have chief priests killed at a mere nod of their head. When the chief priests and Samaria's leaders made their complaint about Archelaus, they pleaded with Augustus not to install another king, but rather to take away Jerusalem's special status and absorb it as a normal city in Syria, subject to the Roman legate. This would restore the high priest to his traditional role as head of society, supported by fellow priests as administrators of the laws. Ordinary Judeans probably saw things differently, however, because this change meant a huge loss of prestige for their city and possibly employment for them. As long as Jerusalem was a royal capital, there were major construction projects going on and revenue poured in from neighboring cities under Jerusalem's rule. Once it was no longer the administrative and military center, residents had to make a big adjustment. The events of 6 CE, which both Josephus and Luke Acts mention in various ways, illustrate the principle that events do not speak for themselves, but rather independent authors will describe them differently to suit their literary needs. Even the same writer, such as Josephus, can describe them very differently in different places. What do I mean? Although he knew quite a bit about these events in 6 CE, his earliest history, the Judean War, says hardly anything about them. Even though he mentions that period in his war, he is eager to get on with the main subject, the later war of 66 CE, and before that, his beloved Essenes. So he passes over the events of 6 CE with little comment in War II 117 through 118, namely, the territory of Archelaus, having been marked off for a province, Quirinius, a procurator from the equestrian order among the Romans, was sent. He had received from Caesar an authority that allowed him to put people to death. In his time, a certain Galilean man by the name of Judas incited the locals to rebellion, criticizing them for putting up with paying tribute to Romans and tolerating mortal masters after God. This man was a sophist of his own peculiar school, the Greek word hieresis, which had nothing in common with the others. We see here that one reason for Josephus' mention of Judas is to get in the word hieresis, which lets him explain that Judeans respected only 3 old schools of philosophy, Pharisees, plural, and he wants to focus on one of them, the Essenes. That is because the Essenes are well known outside of Judea, and they best illustrate some of war's major themes: Judean virtue, toughness, masculinity, distaste for luxury, and contempt for death. Pharisees and Sadducees, the other 2 old Pharisees, get only a couple of sentences at the end. Let us look again at how little he includes for 6 CE, just enough to keep the story moving the way he wants. The Roman knight Quirinius comes to govern the new province with the authority to execute criminals. Judas the Galilean raised a revolt over paying taxes to Romans, but he was a weirdo with a deviant teaching. He also mentions Judas here to support his later claims about the other rebel figures being sons or other relatives of Judas, who supposedly started a rebel dynasty, though it hardly figures in war. In the sources are 2:433 and 447, and then 7:253. Compare this with the background I explained above, and you see that it is extremely sketchy, even misleading. As we saw, Judea did not become an independent province with its own governor. It was actually joined to Syria, as the chief priest had requested of Augustus, and placed under the legate, who at this time was Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. Josephus also doesn't mention anything about Jerusalem's change of status, or explain exactly what Judas was objecting to. He leaves the readers to join the dots. Becoming a province must have meant paying tribute to Rome. But why would Judas consider that tolerating mortal masters rather than God? Given that Jerusalem had recently been ruled by despotic humans, Herod and Archelaus, and by foreign powers for centuries before them, why would Judas complain now, when Jerusalem was losing its monarch and coming under traditional priestly administration? Tax rates were not going up, but were merely going to different human rulers. My point, again, is that events cannot speak for themselves or complain of inadequate treatment. In war, Josephus's war, where events in the 50s and 60s are the main subject, Josephus can afford to pass over 6 CE with this low-resolution sketch because it is all that he needs. Deficient and misleading though it is, this brief mention of direct Roman rule and Judas's rebellion is enough to keep the story going. When he writes his Antiquities 15 years later, Josephus has much more space at his disposal, 20 volumes. He also has new literary themes, which he uses to explore in detail the long build-up to the war. Antiquities first establishes the excellent character of the Judeans and their laws in the first half, and then devotes nearly 5 volumes, books 14 through 17, to the reign of King Herod and his son Archelaus, showing Herod's close ties with Roman officials. His biggest new theme appears repeatedly in the work's prologue, Antiquities 1, 14 through 15, 20 through 26, which says that the laws of Moses followed by Judeans are superior to any other legal constitution and the key to well-being for all humanity, because they reflect the laws of nature itself. Anyone who follows them will find happiness, whereas those who disregard them suffer disaster. With much more space to work with, Antiquities describes the events of 6 CE in much fuller detail than war could offer. He now explains that Judea was not made a province as war had implied, but rather was rejoined to the large province of Syria. Its main governor, therefore, was the distinguished ex-consul Quirinius, in office from 6 to 12 CE. Quirinius, rather than being an independent governor as war had suggested, accompanied Quirinius, who was plainly in command. With all the new territory added to his province of Syria, Quirinius needed to make a province-wide property registration or declaration, Greek apographe, so that he would know what taxes were owed. Archaeological evidence from the tombstone of a soldier who took part in the assessment confirms that it occurred throughout the whole of Syria from north to south. The use of soldiers also shows that it was an intrusive and likely annoying operation, as they poked around in people's business. Predictably, therefore, Josephus relates that the Judean populace were upset by Judea's incorporation into Syria and the nuisance of this property registration. For decades under the Hasmoneans and then Herod and Archelaus, they had paid their taxes to Judean officials. They could quickly see the results because the money went into Herod's beautifully restored capital, Jerusalem, where they were proud residents. Now instead they had to pay the same amounts, but to a distant foreign treasury they could not see, and foreign soldiers were making the assessment. Josephus relates that the high priest of the time, named Joazar, felt responsible for the unrest because he and his colleagues had been behind this new arrangement. So he worked quickly to reassure the populace. Despite the inconvenience and feeling of humiliation for the moment, it was in their best interest to be a normal city in Syria rather than under a law-breaking king like Herod. Antiquities 18, 2-3. Just when Joazar had convinced them and they were beginning to cooperate, however, this Judas fellow riled them up again. Judas was not even from Judea and so would not be directly affected if he remained at home. He was from the territory of either Antipas or Philip in the north, and they were not involved in the property registration. He and a collaborator named Zadok, we now learn, claimed that it was an outrage to pay this tribute to foreigners. They called for a violent revolt, promising that either God would help them to win, or, if they should fail, they would at least win eternal glory for their efforts. Again, the high priest Joazar managed to restore calm again, and the property assessment went ahead. But Quirinius could see that the high priest had used up his political capital and would be useless in the future. Too many people had come to dislike him, so Quirinius replaced him with another high priest. Josephus makes clear his reason for adding all this detail about 6 CE in Antiquities in a lengthy moralizing reflection. As a leading priest himself, Josephus indignantly claims that Judas and Zadok introduced a new element into Judean culture, namely violent attacks on officials, such as the high priest Joazar, who were devoted to the nation's best interests, charging that the rebels' real motive was private again, not the national welfare as they claimed. He sees their violence as a foretaste of the civil strife and violence that would characterize the war of 66 to 70 and lead God to burn the temple by Roman hands. This again illustrates a central theme of Antiquities: follow the laws and enjoy happiness, or violate them and suffer calamity. In sum, the actual events of 6 CE had no voice. They did not demand to be written up in any particular way. In war, too, Josephus treats them briefly and misleadingly, because that is all he needs. He elaborates greatly in Antiquities 18, 1-5, though still not telling us everything we would like to know. For example, what became of Judas and Zadok personally? But he now uses Judas's rebellion against Quirinius's property registration to illustrate Antiquities' main theme: disaster comes from opposing God's laws. As we now turn to Luke Acts, which connects Quirinius and the property assessment with Jesus' birth, we must remember that the story of that birth could also be told in many ways, or skipped altogether. Mark and John don't have birth stories. They assume that Jesus is from Nazareth in Galilee, and they make this a point of ridicule by Jesus' enemies. In Mark, Jesus' own family come to take him home when they hear of his activities because they think he is unstable. Mark 3, verses 20 to 21. While he repudiates them as not his true family. Mark 3, 31 to 35. When he later visits Nazareth, he is rejected because the locals say they know him, his mother, and his siblings. Why does he think he's special? 6, 1 through 6. John is much the same. When someone hears that Jesus is from Nazareth, he sarcastically asks, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" John 1, 45 through 46. And again, the people of Nazareth say, "Isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is he now saying, 'I came down from heaven'?" in 6:42. Matthew changes all that by including an elaborate birth story and prestigious genealogy for Jesus, claiming that he was actually from Bethlehem, the famous town that produced King David. In Matthew, Jesus' mother and her fiancé Joseph are living in a house in Bethlehem. Matthew 1, verses 18 through chapter 2, verses 1 and 11. Astrologers, magi, from the Parthian world, see signs in the heavens that alert them to the birth of the Messiah. They follow a star that guides them first to Jerusalem, where they ask where the newborn is, and the star then leads them somehow to the house of Joseph and Mary in Bethlehem, in Matthew 2, 9 through 11. Their visit alarms King Herod. Being paranoid about any rivals, he demands that the Magi come back and tell him where the baby is. When they instead go home by another road, Herod orders that Bethlehem's infants under the age of 2 be killed. An angel warns Joseph to take Mary and Jesus off to Egypt. Herod then dies in 4 BCE, and an angel tells Joseph it is safe to return. Joseph is not so sure, however, when he hears that Archelaus has replaced Herod. Fortunately, a communication advises him to go north, so they settled in a town called Nazareth, and that is why Jesus grew up there. Although he does not mention this point, Galilee would have been safer because Herod's son Antipas was still ruling there, and for all his faults, Antipas appears to have been a more competent ruler than Archelaus. In Galilee, the family was beyond Archelaus' reach. Since Matthew dates Jesus' birth well before Herod's death in 4 BCE, he has no reason to mention Quirinius, the property registration, or Judas's protest, which occurred a decade later in 6 CE. When we come to Luke Act's account of Jesus' birth, then we know for sure, A, that it could be recounted very differently. The events of 6 CE did not demand to be mentioned, as in Matthew, and B, that even if one wished to write about 6 CE, that could be done in any number of ways, as in Josephus' war. The events did not require telling in one way only, and different authors would emphasize different points. One could simply mention the transition to direct Roman without details, or mention the junior governor sent to the south, Coponius, but not the bigger picture of Quirinius, or mention that but not the revolt over property registration, or mention that but not Judas, or Judas but not Zadok, or others who might have been involved. Independent writers would write things up how they wished. The author of Luke Acts wished to project a different image, however, from that of Matthew's creator. Throughout his 2 volumes, especially in Acts, we see him trying to mention background political events and personalities. Luke chapter 3 verses 1 through 2, for example, mentions no fewer than 7 rulers to date the appearance of John the Baptist. This all becomes important when he reaches Jesus' trial, for his account is the only one that gives a share to Antipas, mentioned among the characters of Luke 3, on the ground that the Tetrarch has come to Jerusalem for Passover. In Acts, this name-dropping is everywhere. Acts 4 spells out the commandment of the temple, the name of the high priest and his chief priestly circle, and the Sadducees. Acts 5 mentions the famous Pharisee Gamaliel, a real person, as a dissenter in the council. Later volumes name various Roman and Judean eminences, such as Gallio, Felix, Drusilla, Festus, Agrippa II, and Bernice. The author also goes to great lengths to add authentic local color, whether he's describing ship travel and the harbors of the Eastern Mediterranean, the cultural atmosphere of Athens or Ephesus, or human anatomy and illnesses. Unlike the other gospel authors, he wants his audience to know that he knows things. So back to Jesus' birth then. Luke faces the same problem as Matthew, but he handles it very differently. He too wants to explain why Jesus was called from Nazareth in Galilee, though his actual birthplace was far more auspicious and suited to the Messiah descended from David. Seemingly unaware of Matthew's effort, he comes up with something quite different. Assuming that Mary and Joseph were from Nazareth, that was their home, he comes up with another way for Jesus to have been born in Bethlehem. He has heard from somewhere of a property registration, Greek apographe, same word as in Antiquities by Josephus, used by Luke 4 times as noun and verb that occurred while Quirinius was governing Syria. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. So Luke's idea is that Joseph, with his pregnant fiancée Mary, had to travel for the property registration to Bethlehem because it was the home of his distant ancestor, King David, about 1,000 years earlier. Famously, they find no place to stay in the local inn, and so lodge in an animal stall, where Jesus is born, Luke 2:7. They remain in Bethlehem long enough for Jesus' circumcision on the 8th day and Mary's postpartum purification, Luke 2:21 through 28. Then they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, Luke 2:39 through 40. Although Judas does not appear in Luke's account of the property registration itself, the later speech of Gamaliel in Acts 5:37 relates that at the time of the registration, again, apographe, Judas the Galilean led the people in revolt, Acts 5:37. So the question arises, where did Luke get this idea of a property registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, against which Judas the Galilean rebelled? The options are Josephus' Antiquities, where we find exactly these ingredients, or some unknown source that is now lost. If we imagine the latter, and remember that each independent writer would mention different things using different vocabulary, we must conclude that such a source must have looked much like Antiquities, featuring Quirinius as governor of Syria when he administered this apographe. If scholars have hesitated to draw this conclusion, it is because Luke Acts does not simply repeat Josephus. We see striking differences. Most important, Luke 2:1 claims that it was the Emperor Augustus who ordered a property registration across the entire world, or inhabited world, or earth. This means that Luke's notice that Quirinius was governing Syria has no role in the story, except to add a bit of color. Since Augustus orders the exercise across the whole world, Quirinius doesn't matter. Where then did Luke find the name of Quirinius as Syria's governor in connection with a big property assessment? Second, in Josephus, the population's property must be assessed where they live, which makes sense. It is very strange in Luke Acts that people should travel to an ancient ancestral home to register property. I mean, can you imagine the entire world's or empire's population of 50 million or more into motion? All traveling to some distant ancestor's town, if it still exists? Why would they do that when they had no property in those other cities? And how did people decide which ancient ancestor's town to visit? And since most were farmers or ran small businesses as craftsmen or artisans, how could they take the months needed to travel to the ancestor's home? Historically speaking, Luke's picture is downright absurd. But we can understand Luke's elevation of an assessment under Quirinius in Syria to a worldwide affair. This author really likes the word all. Granted, it is a common word in Greek, pas panta. Mark and John have 60-odd occurrences each, and Matthew 120. But Luke and Acts have a proportionately more cases, 145, 160. More important, Luke likes to enlarge his account by insisting that all the people did something, or that people came from every village in Judea to hear Jesus. Luke 5:17, 6:17, 7:29. Likewise, he turns a local event into a global affair in Acts 11:28-30. There was a famine in Judea in the 40s CE under Claudius, Josephus Antiquities 20:51-53. But Luke turns it into a famine throughout the whole world or inhabited earth. It had to be local, however, because people were able to send relief from other places, as Paul and Barnabas do here, Acts 11:31. We should not imagine, therefore, that because Luke described a property registration affecting the whole world, that must have been in his source. It is more likely this author's exaggeration. His source needed only to be a text that made an issue of a property registration when Quirinius was governing Syria, prompting a popular revolt led by Judas the Galilean. Josephus had unique narrative reasons to describe such events, and so he did. Again, the events themselves did not demand such treatment. Even Josephus has all this only in Antiquities 18, because it suits his literary purposes, not in his first account of that year in War II. It is conceivable that some other source had the same collection of events and characters, but why would we think so? The simplest, Occam's razor explanation of Luke Acts' account is that it comes ultimately from Josephus' Antiquities. Judas the Galilean. Gamaliel in Acts 5:37 calls Judas the Galilean, as though Gamaliel's colleagues on the council in the early 30s CE should know of him. Judas was among the 3 most common names, and there were untold thousands of Judases around. In war, and usually in Antiquities, Josephus also calls Judas the Galilean. But at Antiquities 18:4, Josephus first introduces him as a Golanite from a town called Gamala. This is intriguing because Galilee and the Golan Heights were and are two quite different regions with distinctive landscapes. They faced each other across the Jordan and Sea of Galilee. Galilee was the territory of Antipas, whereas the Golan was under his brother Philip. Gamala, mentioned by Josephus as Judas's place of origin, was a natural fortress town in the Golan Heights. King Herod and his successors had used as a base for Judeans brought in from the Parthian Empire to police the robber-filled territories to the east, which Judean pilgrims passed through. We can imagine possible reasons why Jerusalem's loss of status in 6 CE would adversely affect Judeans living in these outposts of the Herodian kingdom, once Jerusalem lost its royal status. What then should we do with these facts? That Josephus knows that Judas was really a Golanite, but still habitually calls him a Galilean, and that Luke Acts follows this usage? There seem to be two main possibilities. One, Judas had a wider reputation as the Galilean apart from Josephus. Josephus knew he was really a Golanite, but usually used the popular name, dropping in the notice about Gamala in the Golan to show off his special knowledge. In that case, Luke would not necessarily have been influenced by Josephus. Or two, Judas and the Galilean label were not in wide use. Perhaps Josephus featured Judas only for his particular literary reasons. For example, to make his thematic point in Antiquities about the terrible consequences of violating the laws. And few others knew much about Judas. Having repeatedly called him the Galilean in war, at 2:433, Judas called the Galilean, Josephus might have stayed with that identifier for convenience in Antiquities, but paused at the first notice to point out that Judas was actually from the Golan. In the latter scenario, we might have expected an independent and knowledgeable source to call Judas the Golanite, or Judas of Gamala. Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abilene. As we have seen, Luke's mention of Quirinius governing Syria at the time of the registration serves no obvious purpose, since the emperor orders the exercise. The possibility that Luke mentioned it to suggest the date of the event would work only if Luke's audience knew Quirinius' dates. But Quirinius' governorship from 6 to 12 CE, roughly, would conflict with Luke 1:5, which places Jesus' and John's births in the days of King Herod, 4 BC, and with Matthew's dating of Jesus' birth. Since the Quirinius notice is not a time indicator, it seems to have no purpose other than to show off the author's knowledge of political trivia. As we have seen, Luke Acts mentions many names of Roman and Judean officials. He does not expect his audiences to know who they were or to go and look up their dates and contexts. The case of Lysanias' serving as Tetrarch in Abilene at the time when John the Baptist begins his career, Luke 3:1, is an impressive example of the same tendency to name drop. This reference is puzzling for at least 3 reasons. First, neither Lysanias nor Abilene appears again in Luke Acts. We can easily understand the other names in Luke 3:1-2, the Emperor Tiberius' 15th year for dating purposes, then Pilate, Antipas, and the high priest, because they are significant characters in the story. But why Lysanias? Our bafflement increases. Second, if we look up Abilene on a map of first century sites, by the way, in Greek, Abilene is Abilēnē, the district around ancient Abila. But suppose we looked up Abilene on a map of first century sites. today known as Souk Wadi Barada. The site is in modern Syria, about 21 kilometers, 12 miles northwest of Damascus, and 100 kilometers, 60 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. But there were many small principalities like this in Syria and Lebanon, many of them more relevant to life in Judea, which Luke does not mention. Why mention Lysanias' tetrarchy in Abilene if it is irrelevant to this story? Third, we do know about a tetrarch of the Abilēnē region named Lysanias, but he ruled long before Luke's story time, from 40 to 36 BCE. The famous Roman Mark Antony had him executed in 33 BCE, back when King Herod was beginning his reign, and more than 60 years before Jesus and the Baptist appeared in Luke. So, why does Luke even mention him here? Strangely, scholars have devoted much of their attention to speculating about whether a later tetrarch named Lysanias was in office around 30 CE. That is possible, but we have no evidence of it. Anyway, even if there were a Lysanias in 30 CE or so, that would not explain why Luke chose to mention him when he and his Abilene are irrelevant. Readers will probably have guessed by now that the Lysanias of the 30s BCE and his tetrarchy of Abilene are important in the later volumes of Josephus's Antiquities. In both War and Antiquities, Josephus describes Ptolemy son of Menneus as a mid-1st century BCE king of Chalcis and master of Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. That Ptolemy is significant as the father-in-law and later husband of a Hasmonean princess named Alexandra. War 1:103, 185 through 86, Antiquities 13, 392, 418, 1439, 126, 297. It's in several places. In 40 BCE, Josephus explains Ptolemy's son Lysanias inherited his father's tetrarchy. Lysanias himself remains important because, with his blood connection to the Hasmonean dynasty, which Herod brings to a murderous end, he tries to forge a regional alliance against the Romans and their man-king Herod, in favor of the Hasmonean Antigonus and his backers in the Parthian world, at a time when the Parthians were feeling feisty after their incursion into Syria in 40 BCE. Lysanias thus becomes a significant regional power broker in Josephus. So Josephus keeps referring to Lysanias and his tetrarchy. After Mark Antony removes him at the urging of his lover Cleopatra VII, Lysanias' son Zenodorus, or Zenon, leases back his father Lysanias' tetrarchy from Rome and uses it as a base for attacking his enemies, including Damascus, until Augustus finally brings the tetrarchy under Herod's direct control. This makes the humiliated Zenodorus, son of Lysanias, into a permanent enemy of King Herod. When Herod dies in 4 BCE, the house of Zenodorus goes to Philip, Herod's son. But here's the important point. War continues to call this region long after the deaths of Lysanias and his son Zenodorus the house or kingdom of either Lysanias or Zenodorus. But Antiquities stays consistently with the Tetrarchy of Lysanias as a fixed name no matter who is governing. Why? The most obvious reason is to help Josephus's audiences remember the region he is talking about. Lysanias was the first tetrarch to put the place on the map, and so Josephus continues to use that ruler's name for it. Thus, when he says that the Emperor Gaius Caligula gave the Tetrarchy of Lysanias to Agrippa I in the late 30s CE, Antiquities 18:237, or that Claudius confirmed the grant of Abila of Lysanias to Agrippa 19:275, he does not mean that Claudius took it from Lysanias. He is using his established name for the place. This is clearest when Claudius gives the region to Agrippa's son, Agrippa II. Josephus there calls it Abila. This had been the Tetrarchy of Lysaniases. If there were a new tetrarch in the 20 CE who was also named Lysanias, that would be a neat coincidence only. Josephus calls it Lysanias' tetrarchy because of the long-gone ruler of the 30s BCE. It is hard to imagine that another writer would have written as Josephus does. His motive for referring to Abila as the Tetrarchy of Lysanias is obvious. He has written such a full narrative of events going back many decades that this helps his audiences to follow. An author writing only of current or recent events would not have Josephus's reason to link the territory with Lysanias. None of this proves conclusively that Luke Acts was influenced by Josephus's Antiquities. But keeping to our first principles above, we know for sure that A. Lysanias as Tetrarch of Abila played an important and distinctive role in Josephus, whereas B. he has no role at all except in secondary use to advertise Luke's knowledge in Luke 3. If Luke did not get this information from Josephus, his source must have tracked Josephus's habits closely, and that is very hard to believe. It is true that Josephus always speaks of Abila, never of Abilene as Luke does. But this is not surprising. Every ancient town had an agricultural hinterland, and the standard way of indicating it was to expand the town's name with an ADDENDUM ending. We see this elsewhere in Josephus when he speaks of a town called Akrabeda and its region of Akrabēnē, or the town of Narbada and its region of Narbadatene. Tetrarchs were expected to rule regions, not single towns, so it would have been natural for Luke, if he recalled from Josephus that Lysanias was a tetrarch in Abila, to call the territory Abilēnē, or Abilene. And I've just been pronouncing it Abilene, but it's Abilēnē, and that's that ending. The simplest explanation of this pointless mention of Lysanias' tetrarching in Abilene at Luke 3:1 is that it vaguely recalls Josephus' consistent remarks about Lysanias' tetrarchy of Abila passing to Agrippa I or II. If Luke recalled Josephus' remarks about Gaius's or Claudius's giving Lysanias' tetrarchy to Agrippa I, he might have supposed that a Lysanias had been tetrarch around 30 CE, even though that was not Josephus' meaning. Derek butting in here to recap. According to Steve Mason, Luke's mention of Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abilene, or properly Abilēnē, is best explained as an understandable historical mistake caused by Luke's dependence on Josephus. Josephus describes a ruler named Lysanias, who was executed decades before the time of Jesus. But he later continues to refer to the Tetrarchy of Lysanias as a territory that still existed and was reassigned by Roman emperors to other rulers. Luke appears to have remembered Josephus' references to this territory, but misunderstood what they meant, assuming that a man named Lysanias must still have been ruling it around the year 30 CE. In other words, Luke seems to have inferred the existence of a contemporary tetrarch named Lysanias based on Josephus' language about the region, even though Josephus did not mean that Lysanias himself was alive at that time. This kind of mistake fits well with the fact that Josephus continued to call the territory after Lysanias, and Luke misunderstood this point. Now, back to Dr. Steve Mason. Theudas, another generic rebel. In the speech that Luke writes for Gamaliel, which is set in the early 30s CE, not long after Jesus' resurrection, the eminent Pharisee opposes the Sadducees' harshness toward Jesus' early followers. Gamaliel proposes leaving them be, on the ground that if their movement is not from God, it will die out, whereas if it is from God, they should not be opposing it. To prove his point, Gamaliel recalls Acts 5:36-37. Some time ago, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody important, and maybe 400 men attached themselves to him. But he was soon done away with, and all those who followed him were broken up and came to nothing. He continues, after him Judas the Galilean arose in the time of the property registration, but he too was destroyed, and those who followed him were scattered everywhere. Notice the function of Theudas and Judas here. For Gamaliel and Luke, both men are of the same type, troublemakers or rebels of some kind. Nothing more needs to be said. But where did Luke get such information? Josephus' war has no reason to mention Theudas because it relates nothing of the mid-40s when Cuspius Fadus was procurator. Antiquities 20, however, makes Fadus' campaign against a certain Theudas the outstanding event of that procurator's tenure. And Fadus marks an important turning point in Antiquities because he is the first procurator after the death of King Agrippa I, grandson of King Herod. The Emperor Claudius had become a close friend of Agrippa, who had even helped him become emperor. Because of this extraordinary bond, he gave Agrippa a kingdom larger than that of his grandfather Herod's, and he eventually expected him to rule southern Syria for a long time, since he was only about 50. But Agrippa died suddenly after just 3 years in office, in 44 CE, deciding that his 16-year-old son was too young to take over and not trusting any other regional elites to be king. The emperor decided to return Judea to Syria and to the previous system of sending a procurator to Caesarea. Fadus is the first of these new procurators. Claudius sent him to calm the turmoil that followed the king's unexpected death. Just as in the past, ruling power had rested in Jerusalem with Agrippa I, as earlier under Herod. Agrippa's death shifted it back to Caesarea. This meant that Judeans, who had been thrilled to see Jerusalem become the regional power again, were suddenly weakened again, as in 6 CE, losing prestige and status. Josephus notes that all the non-Judean neighbors wildly celebrated the Judean king's demise, especially the auxiliary soldiers. They were mostly Samaritans, as we have seen, who hated Judeans. They had been forced to serve under the Judean king in a city, Jerusalem, that required them to observe Judean laws. When Agrippa died, they could not believe their luck, and so their celebrations were reportedly crass and crude, according to Antiquities 19, 356-59. This political change recalled the time of Judas's rebellion, and Josephus will soon relate that Judas's sons were crucified by the next procurator, a few years later after Agrippa's death. We may speculate that these men were active in the violence of the period on the Judean side, Antiquities 2102. Anyway, Claudius first sent Fadus to deal with the turmoil after Agrippa's death, ordering him to use the auxiliary army to watch the frontiers between Judea and its neighbors, which were flashpoints of hostility. After breaking this dismal narrative to quote a decree issued by Claudius for the protection of Judeans everywhere, and then for an uplifting account of the Abilēnē royal family's embrace of Judean law and custom, Josephus focuses on Theudas as the main concern of this first post-Agrippa procurator, Theudas. Theudas, he says, attracted a following by claiming to be a prophet and promising that he would part the Jordan River. Was Theudas driven by anti-Roman feelings? That is not clear. Josephus frames Theudas' term by mentioning the regional ethnic strife that followed the death of Agrippa after the unseemly celebrations involving the auxiliary army. Since Theudas is involved with these conflicts among Judea's neighbors and the Samarian auxiliary army, it seems more likely that he was motivated by local hatreds and protecting Judean interest rather than opposing the idea of Rome or something grand like that. But that would make his situation and motives very different from those of Judas the Galilean, who protested Jerusalem's change of status and the payment of taxes directly to Rome. Josephus had no interest in explaining Theudas' motives, however. He was an aristocratic historian, writing for like-minded men in Rome. Such people, like the ruling class of most nations ever since, could see only bad motives in anyone who showed independence from the established ruling consensus. For Josephus, such men were all disturbers of the peace. End of story, whatever their motives. Nothing good could come from their misguided ambitions, whether they advocated symbolic prophetic actions like Theudas, or they called for political violence as Judas did. They were all bad actors, and that is all that Josephus' Roman audience needed to know. Josephus says that when Theudas heard of Theudas' following, he sent auxiliary cavalry troops to shut them down. The ever-eager Samarian auxiliary captured Theudas, cut off his head, and stuck it on a pole in Jerusalem. This vivid story further develops Antiquity's narrative of growing disturbances and disastrous results as people failed to follow the laws under the administration of the senior priests. All this is leading up to Jerusalem's catastrophic destruction. Needless to say, the historical Theudas could not have been any more than Judas was, an intrinsic rebel who woke up each morning wondering what havoc he could wreak. Theudas' concerns in the 40s must have been different from those of Judas a generation earlier. For Josephus, however, he was another deluded crank. Perhaps he was. But as historians, we are interested in his actual motives. If only we could interview him. Theudas appears as a generic troublemaker to us only because that is how the aristocrat Josephus chose to present him. But even Josephus can present the same figure in very different moral terms. We can see this with his enemy John of Giscala, who appears in war as a rotten scoundrel from the start, but in his autobiography as a decent fellow like Josephus at the beginning, who changed only later. The high priest Ananus II gets the opposite revision. In War II and IV, he is the most admirable, courageous, and noble man alive, whereas in Antiquities 20, he appears as a savage and unlawful Sadducee. Whoever Theudas was, he cannot be reduced to the status of a rotten rebel. An author other than Josephus would presumably have written about him more sympathetically, or at least differently. Now, if Josephus features Judas in 6 CE and Theudas in 44 to 46 CE as exemplary bad guys, while noting there were many others, some of whom he briefly names at Antiquities 24-5. And Luke chooses Judas and Theudas and gives them the same aristocratically slanted generic roles. Where did he get this impression? These are not autonomous facts that any observer would have seen. They betray an author's compositional perspective. And that author is either Josephus or someone who wrote a remarkably similar narrative. Scholars have often commented on the chronological disparity between Josephus and Acts, with Gamaliel claiming, circa 30 CE, that Theudas was active some time ago and that Judas came after him. This is one of those discrepancies that leads people to assume that Luke must not have used Josephus. But what does the difference really tell us? Obviously, Gamaliel could not have dated Josephus's Theudas correctly to the 40 CE because Luke puts Gamaliel's speech more than a decade earlier. If Luke wished to sound informed about Judean affairs and remembered Theudas from Antiquities 20 as the most prominent troublemaker of Josephus's later works, he had no choice but to bring his date forward. He could have redated him between Judas and Gamaliel, to be sure, but if he was changing things around anyway, why not put him first? A neglected point strengthens the possibility that Luke knew Theudas from Josephus's Antiquities, and that is the strangeness of the name. Like Sicarii, which we're going to mention soon, the name Theudas does not appear in text before Josephus and Acts. It is Greek, but it first appears after Josephus, otherwise in the mid-2nd century. And one of the two authors who cites the name, then Aulus Herodian, knew and used Josephus's works. Herodian explains this form of the name as a diminutive of the older Theodorus, gift of God. He compares it with Zenos, a shortening of Zenodorus, gift of Zeus, Metras, a shortening of Metrodorus, mother's gift, and Pythis, a shortening of Pythodorus, gift of Pythian Apollo. In all these cases, the older and fuller version is well attested, but the shorter one becomes fashionable only in the 2nd century CE. My point: we should not expect to find several Theudases around in the early 1st century CE, especially not significant figures involved in political violence. Theudas was not a common name, so it is unlikely that the author of Luke Acts knew of a notorious Theudas other than the one described by Josephus. Now it's Derek jumping in again to recap or summarize this point. Steve Mason argues that Luke's treatment of Theudas in Acts 5 is best explained by Luke's literary dependence on Josephus, combined with a lack of concern for precise chronology. In Antiquities 20, Josephus discusses Theudas as the major disturbance under the procurator Cuspius Fadus, and then immediately follows this account, the next paragraph, with a notice about the execution of the sons of Judas the Galilean. Because these two items appear next to each other in Josephus's narrative, some scholars have suggested that Luke may have mistakenly inferred that Theudas preceded Judas historically, leading to the reversed order in Gamaliel's speech. Mason regards this as a plausible explanation, but he does not think the case depends on Luke making a simple chronological blunder based on adjacency in Josephus's text. Rather, Mason emphasizes that Luke's broader practice elsewhere shows little interest in tight historical sequencing when it conflicts with his rhetorical or theological goals. For Mason, what matters most is how Luke uses Theudas and Judas functionally. Luke treats both figures as generic examples of failed popular movements, adopting Josephus's aristocratic perspective, in which diverse disturbances are collapsed into a single moral category of troublemakers. Theudas, a vivid and memorable figure in Antiquities 20, stands out as an especially useful example, and the rarity of the name strongly suggests that Luke knew Theudas only from Josephus. Luke's decision to place Theudas before Judas, whether influenced by Josephus's narrative proximity or by Luke's own rhetorical ordering, reflects his aim to construct a persuasive illustration rather than to reproduce Josephus's chronology. So in short, Mason concludes that Luke was borrowing from Josephus, reshaping the material to serve his argument, and was not particularly concerned with historical precision so long as the example achieved its rhetorical purpose. And he's also mentioned to me that there's no way Luke had in mind his audience would have known how to fact check or find out whether or not he's accurate in this information. Well, here's another historical blunder by Luke Acts. You wonder if inerrancy will ever get thrown out the window. But now back to Steve. Sicarii and the Egyptian. The next two items, Sicarii and the Egyptian, likewise play a prominent role in Josephus, where they are part of the narrative fabric, whereas in Luke Acts, they contribute nothing much. They appear in a single phrase or sentence before vanishing. Josephus's audience could form pictures of these figures from Josephus's descriptions, whereas the audience of Luke Acts could learn nothing. In the Christian work, they are mere names, apparently used for a dash of narrative color, with no other function. In Acts 21, Paul has recently arrived in Jerusalem. He is unwelcome, as he guessed he would be. See Romans 15:25-32. Because Judeans, including those who follow Christ, have heard that Paul trash talks Moses' laws, the Judean people, and the temple. He manages to appease the Judeans who have followed Christ with the help of Jesus' brother James, but not most others in Jerusalem. When they see him in the temple, they grab him and start to beat him, causing a riot. The tribune of the auxiliary cohort, based in the fortress Antonia, overlooking the temple, sees the disturbance and brings a few soldiers to arrest Paul, to find out what the problem is. As they are taking him up the Antonia staircase into the garrison, the following conversation ensues. Paul to the tribune, "Is it all right if I speak to you?" Tribune to Paul, "Wait, you know Greek? So then you aren't the Egyptian who some time ago caused a big ruckus and led 4,000 men of the Sicarii into the desert." Paul to the tribune, "I am a Judean fellow from Tarsus in Cilicia." No matter how you read this, it sounds peculiar. If the tribune was used to dealing with locals who spoke Hebrew but mostly not good Greek, it would be understandable that when he heard one speaking correct Greek, he would express surprise and maybe relief because communication would be easier. Likewise, the exchange might have made some sense if the tribune was sure that Paul was the Egyptian and expected him to speak Demotic Egyptian. But how would the tribune know that language? Anyway, the story has just made clear that the tribune has no idea who Paul is, so his response makes little sense. That is, why would he respond to Paul's question with this very specific statement of who Paul was not? Just because he knew Greek? The Egyptian who led 4,000 Sicarii into the desert? So you are not Eleazar, son of Ananias? Or you're not Joseph from Asochus, who used to make excellent pottery? No, let me guess. Are you Dorcas, the money changer, who has such a bad reputation for cheating? There are shades of Monty Python humor here. Many Judeans, including Josephus and the chief priest who worked with Roman officials, but also all sorts of traders and artisans knew decent Greek along with Hebrew and Aramaic. The tribune's question seems highly artificial. It could not have been asked in real life, but is rather aimed at Luke's literary audience. It suggests that he knows all these exotic details: an Egyptian, Sicarii, going into the desert, even though his audience would not, since he explains nothing. These names have zero role in Acts. They assure the audience that the author is worthy of trust. But that brings us back to our question. Where did he find these nuggets to cobble together in such statements? Both Sicarii and the Egyptian play significant roles in Josephus's works, but in no other texts that are known to us. Let's look first at Sicarii. First, we should understand that Sicarius singular and Sicarii plural are not Greek. They are Latin words built from the noun sica. This was a curved knife designed, unlike military swords and blades, for easy concealment and close-up stabbing. They were also used in gladiator combats, which pitted the speed and agility of a Thracian armed with a sica for close-in stabbing against the heavy equipment, including the legionary straight-bladed gladius of the Murmillo. Aside from gladiatorial combat, however, a Sicarius was an assassin who used that specially designed blade for murder by stealth. He would either go into a crowded urban space, stand next to his target, draw the sica and stab him, walking away in the crowd as he fell to the ground. Or he might be trusted aid of a rich man with access to private rooms. At an opportune moment, he would walk into a bedroom and dispatch the target with his concealed sica. The treacherous nature of murder using a hidden sica made it notorious in Rome, especially during times of civil war. A law passed in 81 BCE coupled Sicarii with poisoners as particularly heinous murderers who deserved execution if they were lucky, accompanied by gruesome dismemberment if they were not. Sicarii was thus a word that put fear in Roman audiences, a bit like butcher when used of humans in English. Josephus used the word Sicarii often, 15 times in War and 4 times in Antiquities 20. In both books, he introduces the word while describing a rash of concealed knife crime that broke out in the late 50s of the Common Era in Jerusalem. War 2:254-57 describes precisely what I have explained above. Armed men entered Jerusalem's crowded spaces at festivals and killed high-standing Judean enemies. The first victim was a high priest named Jonathan, and his high-profile murder prompted many copycat killings. Josephus claims that upper-class Judeans became so fearful that they began to steer clear even of old friends when they approached, being unsure whether they might have a concealed knife. Antiquities 20 further explains that Jonathan's murder was a contract killing arranged by the Roman governor of the late 50s named Felix. Jonathan, though he had been the one to persuade Nero to send Felix as governor in southern Syria, constantly criticized his poor management of affairs and probably his lust-driven marriage to the Herodian princess Drusilla, Antiquities 20, 162-65. When Felix ran out of patience with this nagging, he bribed Jonathan's most trusted friend with a huge sum. This man, Doris, contacted some bandits and treacherously paid them to kill the high priest with concealed knives. The Antiquities version elaborates on that work's distinctive theme. That violation of the divine laws leading to destruction, he explains, that these murders often occurred in the temple courtyard, polluting sacred ground and requiring God's destruction of the temple at Roman hands, which Josephus's war was described in detail. Here is an important point to remember. A Sicarius, like a poisoner, worked alone. They did not work as teams, and there was nothing for a Sicarius to do in a desert. When the Roman orator Cicero, the heaviest user of Latin Sicarius, uses the word, it is nearly always singular. That is because he is either prosecuting or defending some individual against the charge of being a Sicarius. He once remarks that there were many Sicarii in Rome, but that refers to a type, just as we might speak in the plural of liars, cheats, robbers, or murderers, without meaning that they acted in groups. We would be speaking of a class of criminals, not of an organized group. But Josephus always uses Sicarii in the plural, as Axe's tribune does. When Josephus first uses the word in both War and Antiquities, he uses the plural because he is speaking of this class or type of criminal, like robbers, individual killers who use concealed knives. Later in War alone, however, he uses the word more loosely as a term of political abuse, not for actual Sicarius activity. A group that had armed itself in Jerusalem to fight against other militant groups more than Romans and faced defeat when their leader was killed. That is, a group Josephus despises as troublemakers, took their wives and children off to the remotest part of the desert for safety in 66 CE. They settled on the fortified rocky outcrop called Masada, where they set up their own off-grid society and hoped not to be disturbed by either Judean enemies or Roman legions. And they succeeded, not only for the duration of the war to 70 CE, but for several years after that, until the third post-war governor, Flavius Silva, decided that he needed this natural fortress for his army in the spring of 74 CE. Josephus calls these refugees in the desert Sicarii. Collectively, though the term has now lost its practical meaning, they are not killing anyone by stealth. They murder only when they conduct local raids on Judean towns, such as the oasis of En-Gedi, in search of fresh food for their families. Why does Josephus so readily use Sicarii, both in the proper sense for stealth murderers and for this mass of hated refugees who fled to the desert, when no other Greek author uses the word? Presumably because Greek audiences elsewhere would have no idea what the word even meant. Greek writers living elsewhere would presumably have used native Greek terms for a killer or knife wielder. But Josephus is writing in Rome for audiences who are surrounded by Latin and are familiar with at least key words in that language. So he transliterates a number of Latin terms. He also uses many standard Greek equivalents for Latin words that pertain uniquely to Roman institutions such as Senate, Consul, Tribune, Caesar, as imperial title, Imperium, and so on. It made perfect sense for him because he was writing in Rome to import this Latin scare word, Sicarii, into his Greek. At first, it perfectly matches the stealth murderers he describes. His later use of it as a collective term of abuse would also make sense to Roman audiences, who were used to politicians calling their political enemies bandits or cutthroats. Most scholars assume that there was a real anti-Roman group in Judea known as Sicarii. Those involved supposedly gave themselves this Latin name, or they received it from Roman officials. If that were so, Luke might simply have referred to this well-known group. That assumption, however, runs counter to all the evidence. First, Josephus's descriptions of Sicarii knife crimes committed by hired gangsters who killed high level at the instigation of the Roman governor Felix do not indicate a rebel group, let alone any anti-Roman one. Second, if such a rebel group had existed in Judea, why would it call itself by a Latin name that few Judean contemporaries would understand, and one that indicated only a sneaky means of murder rather than their political aspiration? That is, would they not have used a Hebrew slogan meaning freedom fighters, sons of Judah Maccabee, or Judean resistance movement? Third, When Josephus uses Sicarii of the group that fled to Masada, they do not fight Romans or anyone else, but the opposite. They clear out of Jerusalem in mid-66 CE, 1.5 years before the Romans arrive, to get as far from the internal Judean violence as possible. Fourth, what Roman officials were present in Judea, aside from the procurator and his tiny entourage? Who would have any reason to use the Latin label for the knife crime in the late 50s, but especially for those who fled to Masada? In the Eastern Empire, Roman officials used Greek for communication, as we see with the Tribune of Acts. The auxiliary cohorts were locally recruited Sumerians, who presumably spoke some Greek along with their native Aramaic. Latin terminology was irrelevant for them. Admittedly, War II 425 says that they called knife assassins Sicarii, implying that some unnamed others came up with this name. But we should not take this literally. Josephus says the same about the group he calls zealots. Sometimes he says that they were called this by unnamed others. Sometimes he says that they called themselves by this Greek name and ridicules them for it. In several studies, however, I have tried to show that Josephus himself must have come up with the Greek name because of the way he plays on its meaning, which only works in Greek. Likewise, Josephus's use of Sicarii for those who committed the rash of murders of Judeans in the late 50s and early 60s makes sense only as his word choice for his Roman audiences, who would appreciate its meaning. In one of his descriptions, Antiquities 2186, he explains that this crime, which began under Felix, became a general menace under Festus in 59 to 62 CE. Here, Josephus further explained that these murderers used a knife sort of like the Persian Echinokes, scimitar, but even more like the Roman Sica, from which comes their label in Antiquities 2186. He leaves it unclear who supplies the label, whereas most scholars assume that this was a commonly recognized name. I have shown why it is easier to suppose that Josephus came up with the label because of his unique situation, writing Greek in Rome, and that is why he left its origin vague. In any case, the crucial point for us is that this Latin term is at home in the works of Josephus, and nowhere else, as far as we know. Certainly not in Luke Acts, where it appears once in passing and puzzlingly. In the Tribune's artificial question to Paul, since the term bears all the markings of Josephus, he is Luke's most likely source. Even if I am mistaken about all that, my next observation would explain how Luke came to connect Sicarii with the Egyptian and into the desert. Three different things in Josephus, but unified in the Tribune's question to Paul. It is hard to imagine an alternative source. Josephus describes the outbreak of Sicarii knife crime in three places: in War II 254-57, and twice in nearby passages in Antiquities 20, 162-65, and 186. In all three passages, immediately after describing these Sicarii, he passes on to a different kind of threat to Judean society: false prophets who led their followers into the desert. This proximity alone would explain Luke's fusion of two opposed phenomena in Josephus: the Sicarii and the desert. But there is more. One of these false prophets, in both War and the first Antiquities passage, is labeled the Egyptian, a name that only makes natural sense in Josephus. And let me explain why. War II 258-59 follows immediately the description of Sicarii knife crime, which occurred in the city. Josephus says another group of contemptible men didn't engage in urban killing, but were equally dangerous to the public because they were deceivers and tricksters who led masses of people into the desert. They promised to show them various miracles and signs of deliverance there. The governor Felix went after such groups, however, and destroyed them. Immediately after that, War II 261, Josephus relates that the Egyptian false prophet then came along and he managed to attract 30,000 followers, whom he led first into the desert to the east and then back again to the Mount of Olives. From there, overlooking Jerusalem, the temple, and the Antonia fortress, he explained to his massed followers that they were going to stream downhill up the other side and overrun the auxiliary garrison. This was absurd. But anyway, Felix got wind of it and intervened with his professional auxiliary force. The Egyptian escaped with some of his followers. Antiquities 20, 165-72 has the same sequence of A, knife crime initiated by Jonathan's murder, B, false prophets leading their followers into the desert, and C, one example of these, the Egyptian, but as usual changes the story. In this later account, the Egyptian has nowhere near 30,000 followers and does not plan to overrun the auxiliary garrison. Rather, looking down from the Mount of Olives, he promises that at his command the walls of Jerusalem will collapse, like the walls of Jericho in the biblical story, and he will be able to enter at will and take over. But his end is the same as in war. Felix and the auxiliary cohort attack him and kill 400. The third passage in Antiquities 20 describes renewed Sicarii activity under Festus, and that the governor's use of auxiliary against a certain charlatan who had promised the people salvation and relief from all their problems if they would be willing to follow him into the desert. Antiquities 20, 188. So here we have all the ingredients of the tribune's question to Paul in Acts. In Josephus, they are distinct, but mentioned one after the other. Acts has the tribune fuse them together, as though this Egyptian fellow led Sicarii into the desert. The question would make no sense in Josephus, since neither his Egyptian, planning to enter Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, nor the Sicarii practitioners of urban knife crime would be able to do what they wanted in the desert. But if we put aside the logical content and simply ask where Luke got the notion of combining these three elements, the solution is staring us in the face. As far as we know, only Josephus even mentioned these three items at all, and both of his histories put them next to each other. So if Luke did not borrow from Josephus, his source must have been exactly like Josephus. But we know of no such source. If Luke borrowed them from Josephus, he was doing exactly what he did in borrowing Quirinius, the property registration, and Judas, Lysanias in Abilēnē, and the generic bad guy Theudas, mixing and matching them to suit his needs, without any concern for their original meaning in Josephus. We may actually have a tell of smoking gun indicating Luke's use of Josephus. This is Luke's label, the Egyptian, which Josephus also uses in both War and Antiquities. But Josephus had a reason to use it, whereas it is more surprising in Acts. That is because, of course, the man had a personal name. His parents did not name their son the Egyptian. The thousands of Judeans who visited Jerusalem from neighboring Egypt, especially at festival times, all had personal names. Now, anyone with access to the Loeb Classical Library edition of Josephus can see from its very long index of names at the end of Antiquities 20 that Josephus loves to drop individual names into his narratives, even though his audiences could not possibly have kept them straight. As we have seen already, the mention of specific names reinforces an author's claim to know what he's talking about. Josephus has left many problems for historians by mentioning many such names, which we can't track down or reconcile. So it is highly unusual for Josephus to call someone by their place of origin, the Egyptian, without giving a name. But this is a rare case in which he did not need the personal name, if he even knew it. That is because he is describing an already small number of individuals, false prophets, who misled the people. Nearly all of them were Judeans or Jerusalemites. So when he says, "At this time a certain fellow from Egypt arrived in Jerusalem saying he was a prophet," Antiquities 20:169, it is enough for this story because he is the only false prophet from Egypt. Having introduced him this way, he can keep referring to him as the Egyptian, and readers would understand. If he had called him Zechariah or something, it might only risk confusion. But would an independent writer who wanted to describe this character perhaps more sympathetically than Josephus do the same? We would expect another writer with different interests to mention the man's name. When Luke calls him simply the Egyptian, as Josephus does, but without Josephus's context, suggests that he is preserving another distinctive aspect of Josephus's narrative. Derek chiming in here. Dr. Steve Mason argues that Luke's references to the Sicarii and the Egyptian in Acts 21 are best explained by Luke borrowing from Josephus, but doing so loosely, selectively, and without understanding the material he was combining. In Josephus, the Sicarii, the false prophets who led the people into the desert, and the Egyptian are three separate phenomena, each described in distinct context, but Josephus discusses them back to back in both War and Antiquities. And because the stories sit right next to each other in Josephus's narrative, Mason argues that Luke seems to have fused them together into a single confused idea. The Egyptian, who led 4,000 men of the Sicarii into the desert, Acts 21:38. That combination makes no real-life sense. Sicarii are stealth assassins who will kill in the crowds, in disguise, not desert marchers. The Egyptian did not command Sicarii, and desert movements in Josephus are led by miracle-claiming prophets, not knife-wielding assassins. Luke's tribune's question then, "Aren't you the Egyptian who led the Sicarii into the desert?" is something that no Roman officer would ever say, because no such figure existed. But it does make sense if Luke was using Josephus. He simply lifted exotic-looking elements from Josephus's narrative and blended them into one dramatic line, assuming it would impress readers with insider knowledge. Luke's audience, unlike Josephus's, would not know the background, so Luke provides zero explanation. The names serve only to decorate the narrative, not to play any historical role. And this is exactly what Dr. Mason's point is. Luke is not preserving independent historical memory. He is borrowing from Josephus, grabbing impressive-sounding details, mixing them and misunderstanding their meaning, just as he does with Theudas and Judas, Quirinius, the Census, Lysanias of Abilene. In short, Luke's handling of the Egyptian is a textbook example of how Luke uses Josephus, selectively, rhetorically, and imprecisely, without concern for the historical coherence that Josephus maintains. And lastly, why call him the Egyptian? It makes perfect sense in Josephus, and very little in Luke Acts. Three Judean schools, and Pharisees as the most precise. The last case of this kind that I'll mention concerns Luke Acts' portraits of the Pharisees. They are a minor background presence in part of Josephus's War 1 through 2, Antiquities 13 through 20, and the life, but a relatively larger background presence in Luke Acts. The first thing to notice is how different the Pharisees look in Luke and Acts, in contrast to the Pharisees of Mark, Matthew, and John. In those Gospels, as we have seen, Pharisees are Jesus' mortal enemies, plotting to kill him because they cannot bear his presence. Mark 3:6, Matthew 12:14, John 7:32, 11:46-53. But Luke Acts could not be more different. Yes, Pharisees criticize Jesus, and he gives as good as he gets, condemning them harshly at times. But Luke takes over much of that from Mark and Q and reframes it to remove its deadly sting. Luke's Pharisees appear instead as more or less colleagues of Jesus. They respect him as a teacher and 3 times invite him to dinner. Luke 7:36, 11:37, 14:1. They warn him to leave Galilee when they get wind that Antipas is trying to kill him. 13:31. And some Pharisees even accompany him on the trip. 17:20, 19:39. Pharisees play no role in Jesus' trial. In Acts, it's the cold-hearted Sadducean chief priest who determined to kill both Jesus and his followers. The esteemed Pharisee Gamaliel, by contrast, bravely speaks up in a council meeting against the Sadducean chief priests to protect the Christians, Acts 5:34. Luke relates that many Pharisees came to believe in Jesus, Acts 15:5, and when Paul is on trial, he identifies himself as both a Pharisee and a proud former student of Gamaliel, 22:3, 23:6, and 26:5. None of this proves that Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus, but the difference of perspective from the other Gospels is quite striking. It is therefore worth noting that Luke's picture fits Josephus's portrait. Recall that Josephus is a proud member of the upper priesthood, and so his attitudes toward the Pharisees are very different from Luke's. Josephus's closest friends and objects of admiration are chief priests and mostly Sadducees, though he is critical of both Sadducees and Pharisees. When Josephus complains about Pharisees, therefore, it is for reasons different from those in Luke Acts, but his account is compatible. Basically, Josephus looks down on Pharisees from above, whereas Luke sees them more favorably as part of Jesus' world among the common people. In Josephus' view, the illiterate masses need guidance from upper priests like himself. The Pharisees are troublesome interlopers. We might imagine them top-notch defense lawyers today, who annoy establishment prosecutors, the DA's office, when they use their precise knowledge of laws and case histories to find ways to spare clients from legal penalties. For example, in Antiquities 13:294 contrasted with 20:200. That seems to be what Pharisees did, more or less, and Josephus admits that the common people loved them for this reason in Antiquities 13:297-98. Josephus himself favors Sadducean harshness in applying the laws of Moses, but he complains that Pharisees, because of their reputation for precision in the laws and their huge popular support, are a nuisance to establishment leaders in Antiquities 13:288, 401-402, 1741. He also explains that when men who are not Pharisees enter public office and accept positions as magistrates, they must follow the Pharisees' legal principles, or they could not do their jobs. They would be not tolerated by the masses. Antiquities 18:17. Although Josephus is looking at Judean society from the top, whereas Luke is looking up from the bottom, they agree on this stratification. Chief priests and Sadducees are severe in their legal interpretation, and so they are the ones who want Jesus' followers stamped out quickly, whereas Pharisees move easily among the common people and see Jesus as a colleague in some sense. Again, this common outlook does not prove that Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus. Indications that Luke did borrow from Josephus have to do with specific terminology, which bears Josephus's distinctive creative imprint. In discussing Judas the Galilean, we already noted A, that Josephus groups Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes as Judea's recognized philosophical schools, and B, that he uses a particular Greek term for them. That term is Pharisees. Pharisees can refer to any sort of faction or interest group, including philosophical schools. Josephus mainly uses it in this sense. He refers repeatedly to Judea's three Pharisees: Wars 2:119, Antiquities 13:171-73, 298, 18:11-22, and Life 10. Now, it is fortunate for us that we have more independent evidence about Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes than about most aspects of Judean life. Paul's letters and the Gospels, partly independently of each other, refer to Pharisees and sometimes Sadducees. Philo and Pliny the Elder, as well as Josephus, describe Essenes in some detail. Early rabbinic literature mentions Pharisees and Sadducees. But readers of any of these texts would never guess that any one of these groups were members of a triad, let alone of Pharisees plural, as in Josephus. That is because writers who describe Pharisees and Sadducees, authors of the Gospels and Acts, the rabbis, and Josephus most of the time, War 2:161-65 and Antiquities 13:297-28, treat Pharisees and Sadducees as opposed parties, leaving no room for Essenes. Likewise, those who describe Essenes, Philo in 3 extensive passages, Pliny the Elder in his Natural History 573, and Josephus usually as War 2:119-160, emphasize that Essenes are unique and say nothing about Pharisees or Sadducees. And no text outside Josephus calls any of these groups a Pharisees. This means that the trio of Pharisees called Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes was not something self-evident that people who knew about Judea could merely observe and record. It is Josephus's distinctive language, his literary construction. It is also easy to understand why he, writing in Rome, would like this construction. For one thing, he's addicted to the rhetorical rule of 3 and uses it all over the place. For example, he will often describe 2 opposite positions and one taking a middle position. He often claims to read the minds of combatants, for example, to say that some wanted to attack, others to flee in fear, and others to wait and see what happened. But more than that, Greek culture was often said to have 3 main philosophical schools or tendencies, meaning like Cicero on Fate 39 or Tacitus Annals 622. With Stoics and Epicureans usually occupying 2 of the spots, with the third up for grabs. Josephus compares Judea's philosophical schools with Greek counterparts. Explicitly Pharisees with Stoics, Life 12, and Essenes with Pythagoreans, Antiquities 15:371. Implicitly Sadducees with Epicureans, Antiquities 10:277. So again, Josephus has compelling narrative reasons that no other known author has to construct 3 Judean Pharisees, or philosophical schools, from 3 groups that no one else thought of putting together in a threesome. This language is at home in Josephus and nowhere else. There is more. Josephus repeatedly observes in criticism of the Pharisees that among the 3 Pharisees, they are reputed by the masses to be the most precise or accurate interpreters of the law. In Wars 1:110, 2:162, and in Antiquities 1741, Life 191. A claim he resents, as we have seen, because he sees himself and fellow priests in that role. So now, When we return to the book of Acts, we find several striking statements about Pharisees that bear the hallmarks of Josephus's unique literary construction. First, Luke calls both Pharisees and Sadducees Pharisees as a default term in Acts 5:17 and 15:5, even supposing that Judean leaders would see Christ followers as another Pharisees, Acts 24:5 and 14. Second, Luke assumes that Pharisees and Sadducees are seriously opposed, even ready to have fistfights over their differences, Acts 23:6-10, as does Josephus in Antiquities 13:298. In sharp contrast to Matthew, which couples them as allies, Matthew 3:7, 16:1, 7, and 11. Third, Luke calls the Pharisees the most precise or accurate Pharisees, Acts 22:3, 26:5. A small point easily missed is that Luke uses the superlative form of this adjective. You see, the superlative implies at least three elements for comparisons. If he had in mind only Pharisees and Sadducees, he would have used the comparative adjective, more precise. This suggests a memory of Josephus's three Pharisees. A final tell is that in Acts 26:5, Paul reportedly says to King Agrippa II that the Judean leaders know perfectly well who he is and his solid Judean background. They have known about me from the start, if only they were willing to confess it, that I lived according to the most precise Pharisees in our form of worship. And the Greek word there is threskia, as a Pharisee. This is packed with telltale Josephan language, especially the Greek word threskia for Judean worship. The ancients had no category for religion in the modern sense, and this is Josephus's distinctive word for Judean piety and worship. It is attested only 23 times in all Greek literature before Josephus, mostly in Judean, not classical literature. But then Josephus has it a remarkable 91 times. Likewise, of the first 34 attestations of the cognate verb in ancient literature, threskiu, most of them, 23, are in Josephus. It is plainly Josephan language. So in sum, Luke has picked up from somewhere the notion that Judea has three or more established Pharisees, two of which are Pharisees and Sadducees. That Pharisees are supposedly the most precise Pharisees in legal interpretation. In the world of Judean worship, threskia, where did he get all of this? We know of one author only, and he was also the most famous Judean writer of the time, who constructed things in exactly these terms. That author is Josephus. If Luke did not borrow from Josephus, he used a source indistinguishable from Josephus. But all critical methods, historical or scientific, require that we should not multiply hypothetical entities unless that is needed to explain evidence. In Luke's case, we have no need to look farther than Josephus, especially given that these agreements with Josephus bear the distinctive hallmarks of Josephus's unique literary construction. Other possible influences if Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus. You see, this concludes the main part of our investigation, but stay tuned for the section whether Josephus borrowed from Luke Acts. Our always curious MythVision host Derek has asked me, however, whether I could think of other cases in which dependence on Josephus would throw light on Luke Acts. The answer is yes. There are many more possibilities, but I need to make a methodological distinction before continuing. The examples above fit the criteria I mentioned at the start. They are embedded features of Josephus's narratives that suit his narrative interest but have no such thematic or structural roles in Luke Acts. In the Christian work, they are like stones borrowed from somewhere else to build a new wall. They are in secondary use. They reveal Josephus's literary creativity, first of all, which Luke has borrowed. The following examples are different in this respect. They are episodes in Acts that seem to make decent sense as they stand in Acts, but Josephus provides a backstory that would make them even more interesting and even humorous. Unlike the examples we have considered, these cases do not necessarily suggest an origin in Josephus, just because the information Josephus provides for them may well have been widely known. Acts does not depend in these cases on uniquely Josephian literary traits. Nevertheless, they are worth noting. If the other examples indicate that Luke did know Josephus's accounts, then it is entirely possible that he, Josephus, also influenced his telling of these stories. If so, he must have told them with a private smile because he does not explain the background in Josephus. First, Acts 12:20-23 briefly describes the untimely death of King Agrippa I in 44 CE. The king had reportedly fallen out with the Syrian coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon, and they were keen to make amends after whatever offense they had caused. So they requested a hearing with the king. Luke says that Agrippa put on his royal robes, took his seat on his judgment seat, location unmentioned, and gave them a speech. Now, eager to flatter him, when they heard him speak, they shouted that he spoke with the voice of a god and no human being. Because Agrippa did not denounce this impiety, God's angel struck him down and he died a horrible death, eaten by worms. Now, it is possible that the story was in wide circulation in various forms. It is the kind of sensational account that would be retold often. But the only other account we have is that of Josephus in Antiquities 19:343-52. The setting there is different, with no hint of animosity between the king and the coastal cities. According to Josephus, the king goes to the big theater in coastal Caesarea, where one of his palaces is nearby, to lead the celebration of spectacles. This was a regular custom in Caesarea, likely involving sacrifices at the city's temple for the well-being of the emperor. The audience included Agrippa's top officials and supporters. The rest of the story is similar to the one in Acts 12, with one major difference. Josephus explains that on the second morning, Agrippa put on a stunning royal robe that was woven entirely of silver threads. Caesarea's theater seats, we know from archaeology, looked west, and the king on the stage would have faced the east. So when he mounted the stage, therefore, the rising sun illuminated him brilliantly. Before he had said a word, in Josephus's account, contrast Acts, the amazed audience held him as a god because of his spectacular appearance. As in Acts, he realized too late that his failure to stop the flattery was his death warrant. In Josephus's version, he reflects wryly on the situation. The audience held him as an immortal, but he is about to prove them wrong by promptly dying. The king endures 5 days of extreme abdominal pain before expiring. Again, the king's death following some kind of public event would have been well known, so this does not prove Luke's knowledge of Josephus. It is noteworthy, however, that Luke has Agrippa put on his royal robe before sitting down to speak. He says nothing more about the robe, and his mention of it might be without meaning. But for anyone familiar with Josephus's version, where the luminous robe is the central feature, it is striking that Luke should mention it. This episode is not funny, but the next one may have humorous aspects, depending on your sense of humor. It concerns Paul's trial before the governor Felix in Acts 24. The tribune, who turns out to be named Claudius Lysias, learns of a plot to kill Paul. He decides to send Paul to Caesarea to be judged by the procurator Felix. Acts 23, 5-35. The high priest Ananias and his entourage also go there to accuse Paul, and having hired a Roman orator, Tertullus, to make their case. He is a smooth talker who flatters the procurator as a marvelous judge and administrator. Felix delays judgment, however, until the tribune arrives to tell him more about why Paul was arrested. So far, so reasonable. It's what comes next that might cause a smile. Acts 24, 24-27 says that Felix went to visit Paul with his wife Drusilla, who was Judean. Paul began to lecture him about justice, self-control, and coming judgment, and Felix became frightened by this talk. Luke says that Felix was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. When he did not receive one, he left Paul in custody for 2 years, until his successor Festus arrived in Caesarea. None of this proves that Luke knew Josephus, but the backstory in Josephus's Antiquities gives it a different flavor. First, recall that it was Felix who started the Sicarii problem by hiring assassins to kill the high priest. So Tertullus's flattery of Felix as a superb administrator would be nonsense. As for Paul's lecture about justice, self-control, and coming judgment, according to Josephus, Felix lusted after the Herodian princess Drusilla soon after his arrival in Judea, 52 CE, and insisting on having her, Antiquities 20, 139-45. The problem was that her brother, King Agrippa II, had already promised her in marriage to 2 neighboring kings. The first backed out because when the time came, he could not go through with circumcision, which was expected of someone marrying into Judean royalty. The second king, Azizus of Emesa, Homs in Syria, did undergo the operation and married Drusilla. When Felix saw her, she was married to Azizus. So Felix uses a magician's potions to persuade Drusilla to leave her husband, recently circumcised for the marriage, and to marry Felix, who never had any intention of being circumcised or following Judean laws. This shocking story may have been well known, though the Roman historian Tacitus did not know it. He assumed that Felix's wife was a distinguished Roman woman named Drusilla, Annals 12:54 and Histories 5:9. Still, it might have been familiar in Eastern circles, but it is funny to me at least that Acts would just innocently introduce Drusilla as Felix's Judean wife, saying no more than that. Josephus dwells on the lawlessness of the procurator's marriage to Drusilla. He notes that they had a son, but he died young in the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, as a mark of divine punishment for their unlawful union. Acts' observation that Felix trembled in fear when Paul lectured him about justice, self-control, and coming judgment would make good sense against Josephus's background, though Acts does not explain it. Finally, according to Acts 25, when the new procurator Festus arrives to replace Felix, he has no idea what to do with Paul. So he invites the Judean king Agrippa II and Berenice, who have traveled to Caesarea to welcome him as new procurator, to interview Paul. The next day, Acts 25:23, we read, Agrippa and Berenice enter the audience hall with much grandeur and take their seats. When Paul begins to speak, he praises the king because he is minutely familiar with the customs and controversial issues among Judeans. 26:3. Although the reader of Acts would assume that Agrippa and Berenice were a couple, this was not so. She was the sister of Agrippa II, and therefore of Drusilla, who had scandalously married Felix, as we mentioned before. Berenice was not free of scandal herself. As was customary in those times, she was first married in her early teens to the son of a prominent Judean in Alexandria, Marcus Julius Alexander. We don't know what became of that marriage, but by the time she was 16, her older brother had given her to their uncle Herod, king of Chalcis in Lebanon, Antiquities 19, 354. After Herod of Chalcis died in 48 CE, rumors begin to swirl that Berenice and her brother Agrippa were having sex. To stifle these rumors, she married King Polemo of Cilicia, who, like Azizus, agreed to undergo circumcision for the marriage in Antiquities 20, 145-46. According to Josephus, however, Berenice soon abandoned him, as Drusilla had abandoned Azizus because of her passions for her brother. In Josephus, as in Acts, Berenice normally appears as Agrippa II's companion in War 2, 344 and 405, and Life 48 through 49. This no doubt stoked the rumor mill about their sleeping together. The Roman satirical writer Juvenal has fun with the rumor, Satire 6, 156-60. After the fall of Jerusalem, Berenice became the lover of Titus, the much younger destroyer of Jerusalem and future emperor. She lived with Titus in Rome for several years, from 75 to 79 CE, causing a scandal, but he was persuaded to send her home when he became emperor in 79. Suetonius, Titus 7, 1-2. As with Acts' account of Felix and Drusilla, gossipy background may have been known to many people. Anyone who knew Josephus' account of it, however, could only smile at Acts' portrayal of them as a regular-seeming couple, arriving with great pomp and majesty, and Paul's flattery of the king as an expert in Judean customs. That background does not prove Luke's knowledge of Josephus, but someone who knew Josephus' backstory or familiar stories told by others would get more out of Acts' innocent version, which mentions none of these liaisons. Conclusions so far. The main point of this presentation is to offer a new way of thinking about the parallels between Luke, Acts, and Josephus. Those parallels have been noticed for more than a century. But in decades past, Josephus' works were assumed to be somewhat random collections of facts and sources of unknown. To explain how Luke and Josephus came so strikingly to mention the same things, the census under Quirinius and the rebellion of Judas, the supposed rebel Theudas, Lysanias as Tetrarch of Abilēnē, the Egyptian leading Sicarii into the desert, and the Pharisees as Judea's most precise philosophical school, it was fairly easy to suspect a common source of some kind. Scholars made no efforts to explain what that common source was, its reason for existing, structure, or themes. I have argued here that the old solution no longer works. In the intervening decades, we have come to see that Josephus, like every competent author, crafted and controlled his histories to serve his interests. This means that he used distinctive language and that the ingredients of his narrative reflect his particular interest. I have shown how each of the items above, or previously, serves the last 3 volumes of his Antiquities, which he completed in 93 CE. Although they are fully at home there in Josephus' master narrative, they appear only incidentally in Luke Acts, in one-off mentions with no background or follow-up. These are not free-floating data in some kind of neutral language and ready for anyone's use. They all bear the telltale marks of Josephus' literary construction. It seems, therefore, that Luke borrowed them, half-remembered or carelessly reworked, from the most famous Judean author of his day, to help shore up his credibility as a writer. In closing, I should maybe say that I'm unaware of having any motive other than trying to solve this puzzle of the Josephus-Luke relationship. Some scholars have liked my argument because of their own reasons. They favor a date for Luke Acts well into the 2nd century CE. If Luke Acts had heard or read the end of Josephus' Antiquities, he must have been writing after 93 CE. But I do not care about the date of Luke Acts. It makes no difference for any question that I've researched. My argument for Luke's use of Josephus depends exclusively on a basic principle of historical research. If characteristic features of text A appear in text B where they are not characteristic, then B borrowed A, directly or indirectly in some way. Luke Acts and Josephus. Addendum to respond to other possibilities. In the essay, Derek asked me to write on the relationship between Josephus and Luke Acts. I first discussed historical method. The point of that was to establish a foundation for the case studies that followed. The overlaps in names and events in Josephus's Antiquities, especially, and the New Testament double work that scholars call Luke Acts. Because I thought that was enough. I did not make the already long piece longer by explicitly responding to one alternative to my proposed scenario, namely that Josephus, in writing his Antiquities, borrowed from Luke Acts. I did raise that theoretical possibility in the introduction on method. I observed that when you have two texts, A and B, you find sustained verbal agreements between them. Then either A, Luke used B, Josephus, or 2, B, Josephus used A, Luke Acts, or 3, A and B used C, a common source. In this case, lost to us. Or they somehow collaborated, a possibility that would raise many more problems. The premise that requires a choice of some kind, which I spelled out, is that events do not describe themselves. They do not supply the language needed to describe them. Description requires a narrator. Given the nearly endless possibilities of language, independent writers will write differently. For example, if a rash of knife crime breaks out in Judea in the late 50s CE, independent authors writing in Greek would use different vocabulary. Most obviously Greek words for knives, but perhaps some Hebrew or Persian word, as well as making different choices about what to include as examples and names of individuals. We can prove this principle easily because even Josephus himself tells the same stories quite differently, with different word choices and framing and choice of individuals, in his two major histories, War and Antiquities. It is therefore a rock-solid principle, which we use every day in historical work and plagiarism detection, that sustained verbal agreement indicates some kind of literary relationship. They are not independent. This is also the principle that underlies the study of synoptic problem in gospel research. My essay did keep scenario 3, that Josephus and Luke used common sources, in view because that has been the view generally favored by scholars. I tried to show why this would have seemed reasonable a century ago, when people thought of data as neutral and free-flowing, not belonging to any narrative, and when no one asked them to explain what that common source looked like. It was a purely imaginary abstraction, but research has progressed a great deal since then. Since the 1980s and 1990s, we have a rich array of tools for investigating and comparing the linguistic traits of individual ancient authors. This has allowed us to learn a great deal about Josephus's distinctive vocabulary and ways of phrasing. This is important for the following reason. If I am pondering the relationship between two texts, A and B, and I see that B has a number of pronounced and distinctive literary traits, such as putting Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes in a three philosophical school scheme, giving Pharisees a reputation as the most precise of these schools, making the property registration under Quirinius a watershed event in Judea, highlighting the Tetrarchy of Lysanias in the northern Syria, repeatedly uniquely mentioning Latin named Sicarii in Judea, singling out Judas and Theudas from many bad guys, and identifying a false prophet merely as the Egyptian without naming him, and if this author B's distinctive compositional traits turn up vestigially in A, that either the common source used by A and B looked just like B, or A used B. After decades of working on Josephus, my judgment was that the Judean priest's compositional traits, like anyone else's, are distinctive, and that those listed above make sense in his unique situation. For example, he used Latin terminology for Sicarii because he was writing in Rome and trying to make his account meaningful to his Roman audience. Sicarii was a scare word in Latin because it referred to murderers who carried concealed blades for up-close and personal assassination, comparable to the scary work of poisoners. The Romans had a special law and court proceedings for trying accused Sicarii. Josephus refers often, 19 times, to Sicarii in Judea, though they almost certainly didn't call themselves by this Latin name, and Judea lacked a quorum of Roman officials who might have done so. No Greek author whose work has survived transliterates this Latin term except Acts in the Tribune's odd question to Paul. But Josephus had good reason, in his unique writing situation, to make something of so-called Sicarii. When I say that mention of these things in Luke Acts is vestigial, I mean that they have no thematic or ongoing role in that work as they do in Josephus's Antiquities. Now I understand that some readers who are not deeply into this stuff would ask the perfectly logical question, wait a minute, if you see parallels between the two works, why do you insist that it's Luke borrowing from Josephus and not the other way around? Is this some kind of prejudice against Luke? First, I don't insist because my interest is not in conclusions, but I didn't discuss that alternative because no scholar of the past century who knows the material has suggested it, unlike the common source view, which is widespread. No one has advocated Josephus' use of Luke Acts because while it may seem a logical possibility if one does not probe further, it could not explain the evidence, which is what historians do. That's our day job, not imagining abstract possibilities, but doing the harder work of testing them against evidence. If we find one hypothesis better at this than others, we must show our colleagues why that is so. That is what I did in this essay for this video when weighing the standard option, that is, Josephus and Luke used a common source, against the simpler scenario I advocated. Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus. Again, I did not bring up the scenario of Josephus using Luke Acts because it would not explain everything I had just described. The at-homeness of these elements in Josephus but not in Luke Acts. If you're into logic, this is a form of abductive as distinct from deductive and inductive reasoning. It's about the best guesses from available evidence, which are always open to modification if further evidence and new insights come to light. If we should discover tomorrow another text just like Josephus's Antiquities, with the compositional traits I mentioned above, but putting things in the way that Luke has them, meaning putting Theudas before Judas, using a three-school model, smudging Sicarii and Egyptian prophet, I'd be the first to concede that Luke more likely used that source. I don't criticize those who reason if there are two sources that resemble each other, surely the dependence could go either way. But that is a contender only at the level of deductive reasoning. Someone who thought it probable would need not only to imagine it, but to show how it would explain the evidence. Here, I need to make a crucial point that may be missed in the world of the internet. History, especially ancient history, is not and cannot be about nailing down fixed conclusions. It does not require us to believe things, and in fact, we are not permitted to attach ourselves to conclusions. If we did, we could not do the job, which requires conducting open-minded investigations. History is a method and a process of investigation, not a matter of absurd facts or beliefs. Our digital world is so polarized that we may tend to see anyone who offers any opinion as driven by some hidden ideology. In social media, people readily assign others to camps, libtards, TDS sufferers, etc., on the basis of their supposed beliefs. So it can be difficult to accept that some people actually undertake open-minded investigations and that their conclusions are not tainted by a covert worldview. There are even scholars who don't practice history who believe this about history. That is all hopelessly compromised by worldviews and presuppositions and whatnot. I just want to butt in here as Derek and say that if you thought I was biased, clearly I've obviously been critiquing and engaging with the apologetic world. This is the work of Steve Mason. I am not putting these words in his mouth, and you can judge his work based on his evidence, not by my narrating of this video or any of that. This is all Steve Mason's point. Back to Steve. But that's not true. Most historians I know simply love to do what they are trained for, to investigate problems in the human past and propose solutions, without knowing in advance of the investigation what they are going to find. I personally do not care, as a conclusion, whether the Jesus portrayed in John or the Synoptics existed, whether Luke Acts was composed in the 60s, 80s, or 150 CE, or whether Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, or had some other relationship. I do not know whether the author of John was reacting to the Synoptics or unaware of them. I don't know and don't much care on a personal level. Nothing that matters to me depends on any such conclusion. If Luke and Josephus used a common source, or Josephus used Luke, let's have a party and celebrate life. I do not care, personally or existentially, about what my investigations will produce. Conclusions come and go with new evidence. This doesn't mean that I don't have provisional views resulting from thorough investigations, mine or others, that I've carefully worked through. So I do think it most likely that Matthew used Mark as a source, simply because I've tested other hypotheses at length and in detail and can't see how they would explain what we can all see. If I think it most likely that Jesus existed, it's not because I belong to some interest or faith group, but because that seems to explain the evidence already in Paul's letters better than other hypotheses. If others disagree, God bless them. I don't care about conclusions, but like the math teacher who demands to see your rough work and not only your conclusion about how one gets there. The job of being a historian is to investigate, not to preach. If anyone wants to learn more about this, I recommend two classics by great historians who died during World War II. Mark Bloch, The Historian's Craft, and R.G. Collingwood, The Idea of History. My main area of research is Roman Judea, for which the works of Josephus are the chief surviving source. So I've spent much of my career writing and editing word-by-word commentaries on Josephus, trying to understand his works better so that we can use them responsibly for that history. Occasionally, I've seized the opportunity to investigate specific historical problems in depth. See my book, A History of the Jewish War, AD 66 to 74 in 2016. I took up the question of Josephus and Luke Acts not because I had a view about it that I was eager to preach, but simply because a publisher, Hendrickson, knowing of my work in Josephus, but also my training in Christian origins, asked me to write a book about Josephus for New Testament readers. I was honored and happily accepted. The relationship between Josephus and Luke Acts was not central to that book, but it was an unavoidable question, which I took up in the final chapter. I had no prior opinion on the matter, vaguely accepting the common view that Josephus and Luke shared common sources. But since I had now worked intensely on Josephus for some years, when I reconsidered the parallels in Luke Acts with fresh eyes, I was struck by how many of these shared items in Luke Acts reflected Josephus's distinctive compositional traits, but only in vestigial form. That is, they were Josephus's traits, whereas in Luke Acts they receive only passing mention, usually in a single sentence or phrase. They don't go anywhere in Luke Acts. Their thematic coloring comes from Josephus, where they are important to the story. So, we return to the question, but why could Josephus not have borrowed from Luke Acts? This is undoubtedly a theoretical possibility, but historians don't work in the world of theories and abstractions. We must show how each hypothesis we can imagine would explain the evidence. If anyone reading this or listening to this video, technically, thinks it's probable that Josephus borrowed his frequent discussions of Lysanias' Tetrarchy in Abilēnē, the Sicarii, Judas and Theudas, the Egyptian, the property registration, the Pharisees as the most precise philosophical school, and so on from Luke Acts, they will need to show how that scenario would explain the evidence. The historian's work begins with imagining possibilities, but that is only the beginning. We then need to show how the hypothesis explains the evidence. Someone who thought that scenario probable would need to show, for example, why it was likely that Josephus, taking inspiration merely from the tribune's question to Paul in Acts 21:38 about Sicarii led by the Egyptian into the desert, came up with his elaborate portraits of Sicarii in both war and antiquities, 19 references describing their mode of urban murder and the kind of knives they used, and why Josephus called the residents of Masada Sicarii. Again, one would need to explain how Josephus evolved his distinctive and characteristic three-school scheme of Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes from Luke Acts' bare mention of Pharisees as the most precise school. Also, how Josephus produced his elaborate account in Antiquities 18 of the property registration under the Syrian legate Quirinius, accompanied by Coponius, and the incorporation of Judea into Syria, from Luke's brief and very different mention of a worldwide census ordered by Augustus, which required everyone to return to some ancestral homeland and which never happened. I'll wait. The simple reality is that you can't get there from here. The possibility that Josephus took his well-informed emphasis on Lysanias of Abilene in the 30s BCE from a bare and puzzling reference in Luke 3:2 cannot be logically excluded, just as I cannot rule out the possibilities that 100 monkeys hitting typewriters for infinity would produce one of Shakespeare's plays, or that Martians landed in the 1st century and wrote the New Testament. But those possible hypotheses don't explain any evidence. They are surplus to requirements. Josephus could not have taken his information, which intersects with coin and other evidence, but does not duplicate it, from Luke, because Luke does not have it. It is only in Josephus. If he somehow took inspiration from the mere mention of a name in Luke Acts to weave out fantastic dreams, giving deep substance and background to all these names, we would need to rethink everything in Josephus in ways that would constantly run into barriers, because of broadly confirmatory evidence in archaeology and in other independent authors such as Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Pliny the Elder, and Philo. I hope this helps to explain why my essay, which is the backing of this video, did not seriously examine the possibility that Josephus took his information from Luke Acts. The reason is that Josephus has vastly more information on all these subjects, which is elaborately connected with the rest of his narrative, and sometimes intersecting with external evidence. If he took these items from bare mentions in Luke, he would have needed an extraordinary imagination to spin out worlds of fully contextualized narrative from Luke's meager mentions. While that cannot be logically excluded as the Martian authors and typewriting monkeys can't be, that's a meaningless criterion for historians. The only relevant question is whether that hypothesis would explain what you and I can see. And the answer, whether you are a Baptist or a Buddhist, is no. No one who knows the works of Josephus and the text we call Luke Acts, it does not name itself, could find such a hypothesis plausible, and that is why no one has advocated it since a failed effort in the 1890s. I did not exclude it a priori because of some prejudice or hidden worldview, but because it lacks explanatory power. I did not consider Martian authorship or Flavian production of Luke Acts for the same reason. Ladies and gentlemen, I am no longer reading the script. This is Derek Lambert. This is the legendary Josephine expert Steve Mason's work. And this is the best Luke Acts borrowed from Josephus documentary in the world and on YouTube, as well as potentially all the other platforms. I sincerely hope you take the time to go get a copy of many of his works. He has a book, Josephus and the New Testament, and he had the revision later done where he touches this subject. Steve Mason is an expert and very careful scholar about what he's doing with Josephus, the New Testament, early Christian origins, and all of that. And in fact, following this documentary, I plan on doing a live stream to go in depth with him about this very issue. If you appreciate this work, please understand that the time it takes and the money it takes in order to edit, to craft, to create this kind of material is very expensive. And I can use your support. So, how can you help? Well, first of all, you help by helping the scholars buying their books. That gives them reason to come on the channel. I wouldn't have this channel if it weren't for the bright minds that show up and teach. 2, you can join our Patreon. You can buy our courses that we have with the scholars at mvp-courses.com. You can send a one-time donation. You can be part of the Patreon and gain early access and also be able to contact me. These are ways of giving that help. But if you can't afford anything, no problem. I understand that not everyone's able, even though we could really use the help. Liking the video in every video we do. Commenting underneath each video to create dialogue. YouTube rewards channels like that. Subscribing to this channel and hitting the bell and sharing it out there. 4 things you absolutely could do for free, and it would help. It would help us big time. So please do so. What did you think about Luke Acts borrowing from Josephus? Be sure to let me know below. Until next time, never ever forget, we are MythVision.